Chapter 468, The Moon. For a moment, Emlyn White was stiff and his mind was blank, like a marble statue sitting there. Then, he heard the figure leisurely sitting in the thick gray fog indifferently ask, "Why did you pray to me?" Emlyn's mind buzzed and he blurted out, "It's a revelation from my ancestor. She had told us through a dream that the apocalypse is approaching and that we need to make preparations. And I am key in this matter. My mission was to pray to the fool." Hearing the undisguised and detailed response, Klein, who had prepared his answers, was at quite a loss on where to begin. This vampire, Emlyn White, had explained everything he wanted to know. A revelation from the ancestor. Didn't the ancient goddess Lilith perish in the second epoch, long before the cataclysm, and have her authority taken back by the Creator? It was precisely because of this that quite a number of vampires tried to pray to the primordial moon, resulting in an extremely tragic outcome. Moreover, Mr. Dorr had also mentioned that the moon card is empty, indicating that, on the one hand, the primordial moon is most likely the embodiment of some other deity or powerful devil, while on the other hand, it indirectly proves that the ancient goddess Lilith has lost her sequence 0 position, which is generally equivalent to dying. Klein instantly connected the dots. He originally imagined that Lilith, who responded to the sanguine's prayers on particular matters, was a relic from the ancient goddess, such as the uniqueness of the moon pathway. Thus, it would be rigid, passive, and extremely restrictive, but now, its initiative of providing a revelation had overturned his guess. Two possibilities. One is that Lilith is being impersonated by another deity who has occupied a key point ahead of time, preventing any opponents from reaching sequence 0 of the moon's pathway. In essence, the entity doesn't care about the sanguine, and the provided revelation is a kind of test. The greatest suspect is the goddess who had snatched the title of Lady of Crimson, but she's already sequence 0, corresponding to the star in the cards of blasphemy. Why would she covet the moon? Is it to foil the plans of her enemy? The second possibility is that the ancient goddess hasn't fully perished. As long as no other powerhouse has become sequence 0 in the moon pathway, she is able to use a unique and incomprehensible method to continue surviving, waiting for a chance to make her return, just like the Dark Emperor card's description. And perhaps the goddess had taken the title of Lady of Crimson to foil this situation to a certain extent. Going by this logic, Lilith's recent apocalyptic revelation is her struggle to revive after years of preparation. And the fool plays a key role in her revelation. If that's true, then in a certain way, it's an invitation for cooperation. But I'm just a sequence 6 beyonder, so how am I to cooperate with a yet-to-disappear ancient goddess? Let Emlyn White join the Tarot Club? The Sanguine are a race with a long lifespan. They have existed since the second epoch and must know quite a number of secrets. However, that would be me taking quite a risk. Yes, it would be possible to divine whether or not to pull Emlyn into each gathering ahead of time. Yes, there was a similar apocalyptic prophecy in the sites in the spirit world from Yellow Light Venethan. He also pointed out that the Abraham family's curse would be removed by an apprentice who has the help of a hidden existence. This matches Miss Magician's present stage. She is an apprentice who has received the help of me, the fool. That's rather interesting. Has every high-level being that's good at prophecies realized that the apocalypse is unavoidable and have seen the fool's existence and his possible effects? One thought after another flashed through Klein's mind, but his expression didn't change at all. He leaned back in his chair and smiled leisurely. "What did your ancestor ask you to pray to me for?" The calm voice pulled Emlyn out of his stupor, and he shook his head in a slightly dazed manner. "I don't know." At this moment, Klein saw the stars behind Emlyn's chair shift quickly, turning into the symbol of the crimson moon. As expected, the beyonder pathway of the descendants of the ancient goddess, Lilith, points towards the moon. Klein chuckled and said, "In a situation with the 7 orthodox gods and so many secret existences, why would your ancestor think that I would be the key to the apocalypse?" The fool's attitude finally made Emlyn White calm down, realizing that he had encountered an incredible event. He had been forcefully pulled into a magical place by a hidden existence. He is the fool, he isn't actually angry. Is it because I represent the ancestor? I, Emlyn White, am indeed special. I was mentioned by the ancestor, and I received a response from the fool. With this in mind, Emlyn couldn't help but sit up straighter before saying in deliberation, Honorable Mr. Fool, the revelation provided by the ancestor is this. I, Emlyn White, will become the key in saving the Sanguine and clinching victory against the apocalypse. And all of this will begin from my praying to you. The meaning behind his words was, the key to the apocalypse isn't you, but me. This fellow has such a 8th grader syndrome side to him. That's right. He has always been very arrogant and feels self-important. Klein lampooned silently with a popular phrase from the past. Amused, he said, the same question, why me and not the 7 Orthodox gods or the other hidden entities? I don't know. Emlyn shook his head honestly. Klein thought for a moment, then he deliberately said, Actually, I think I understand your ancestor's intentions. She wishes that, with my help, you're able to grow into a true high-level entity and save the Sanguine when the apocalypse happens. Grow? Emlyn said in puzzlement, as you know, us Sanguine have no way of growing on our own. Only through special ceremonies will we gain the bestowment of our elders and relics of the ancestor that allow our advancement. Indeed, it has to be in accordance with the law of beyonder characteristics conservation. In other words, there have to be other ways as long as the basic law is abided to. Klein chuckled. Your knowledge has blinded you, making you unable to see the wider world. Of course, this question will not be answered by me. The answer must be found by you. I will only provide you with an opportunity. He paused for a second, then he said in a condescending manner, Do you wish for such an opportunity? Without any hesitation, Emlyn got up and bowed. That is what I wish for. Where did your arrogance go when facing a hidden existence? Why is there only humility? Klein secretly lampooned as he tapped the edge of the mottled long table and said, But you have to adhere to certain matters. Please speak. Emlyn held back his excitement. Klein smiled and replied, You cannot reveal anything related to me to anyone unless you gain my permission. This includes the Sanguine who were previously present at the ritual. But, Emlyn was somewhat unable to accept the request. Klein asked warmly in a very certain manner, It's likely that Lilith didn't get you to report to anyone afterward? This could be inferred from the fact that there was no prayer content in the revelation. He directly called the ancestor by her name. It sounds like they're old friends. Emlyn's heart trembled. He lowered his head and replied, No. Klein said with an unperturbed smile, This is a secret deal, which is why I responded after you were free from surveillance. Similarly, you don't need to report this to Lilith as it will let certain people notice it. Seeing Emlyn nod in understanding, Klein added, If you want to be the key to saving the Sanguine, you must suffer the pain of the corresponding thorns. For example, you will not be understood by others, be slandered, and looked down upon. You can only silently proceed forward in the darkness while being burdened by your heavy mission. The words that were aimed at him made Emlyn White imagine a corresponding scenario. He, who was always mocked by his kinsmen because of his fondness of dolls, had gotten lost and entered the Harvest Church. Stained with traces of shame, he, who had never been valued and thought highly of by his elders, would silently guard his race from the corner, protecting everyone without anyone knowing. Very soon, Emlyn, who had moved himself, respectfully replied, Your will pass through the earth. Klein leaned back and said very lightly, I tacitly consented to the establishment of a secret gathering, and it is held right here. Are you willing to join this gathering and search for the method to become powerful to save the Sanguine? I am. Emlyn replied without any hesitation. Klein nodded in satisfaction. Do you have any other requests? Emlyn was overjoyed. He said in a hurry, Honorable Mr. Fool, I would like you to help me dispel the psychological cue in me. A bishop of the Church of Earth Mother, I know. Klein calmly interrupted him. He knows. As expected of a hidden existence. Emlyn's head lowered again. Klein let out a soft chuckle. I can help you, but what price are you willing to pay for this? Above the gray fog, he had a very potent spirit vision, and he had previously discovered that the dark-colored psychological Q within Emlyn White's spirit body had at some point mostly dissipated, thinning out to the point of frailty. Klein had intended to resolve the problem by referring to the ritual used to resolve similar problems in the Book of Secrets, but the situation now led him to believe that a secret deed ritual with the Dark Emperor card and the purification of the Sun brooch would thoroughly disperse Emlyn White's psychological Q. Price? Emlyn thought about it for a moment, but he couldn't think of anything that would interest a secret existence like the Fool. Seeing this, Klein took the initiative to say, "I'm very interested in some of your sanguine history. You can use that in exchange." The Sanguine's history? After a moment's thought, Emlyn agreed. "You can think about what you would like to describe first." Heh. Before that, you need to choose a code name from them. Klein conjured the unselected Major Arcana tarot cards on the surface of the long bronze table. Emlyn White scrutinized the cards with interest and said, "The Moon." "I choose the Moon card." Chapter 469, Vampire Queen above the grey fog, inside the palace that looked like a giant's residence. The Moon. Emlyn thought hard about what part of the Sanguine's history that he should tell the Fool. He and the ancestor are old friends, so he must know what happened before the cataclysm, so I don't need to repeat it. In the 4th and 5th epoch, the glory of the Sanguine wasn't rare, and there was a lot of history to talk about, but there was only one most important point. Emlyn quickly came up with an idea. From what he knew, the Fool was likely an ancient god before the cataclysm. Due to certain reasons, he didn't perish and had slept till today, gradually in the process of recovering. This explained why no such secret existence had appeared in the Sanguine records, that had a history spanning millennia, until his honorific name suddenly spread. After some deliberation, Emlyn straightened his back and said, "After the cataclysm, the Sanguine left the center of the historical stage of the northern and southern continents and became nobles of different empires and dynasties as individuals instead of as a race. They either governed a territory or guarded a castle in a key area. This continued until our queen, Blood Moon Queen, Ornia, who led us out of the era of darkness, became the wife of the Trunsois dynasty's Night Emperor. She gathered all of the Sanguine together and the Sanguine became important supporters of the dynasty. At that time, Loans Augustus and Faceless Einhorn had to politely address our queen as Her Majesty. In that era, Queen Ornia was the symbol of beauty. If there was a magic mirror that could answer questions, then the answer to, who is the most beautiful of them all, would be her. The more Emlyn spoke, the prouder he became. He went from being reserved and serious to becoming extremely talkative. A magic mirror that can answer questions, isn't that a Rhodes? I wonder if there are any members of the machinery hive mind who were so bored out of their minds to ask the question, "Mirror, mirror, on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" I wonder how a Rhodes will answer. Klein sat in the same posture, smiling as his thoughts wandered. After droning on and on, Emlyn's expression turned serious. All of this shattered in the War of the Four Emperors. The Night Emperor perished, along with the Queen. The Sanguine suffered a terrible blow, and while trying to reap the final fruits of victory, the four noble families, Augustus, Einhorn, Sauron, and Castilla, split the empire, destroying the royal family which was lacking in high-level beings. The Sanguine had no choice but to retreat to an uninhabited mountain to hide in the shadows so as to maintain the continuation of our race. Just as I expected. The 7 gods were already the 7 gods during the War of the Four Emperors. Klein thought of the statue of the 6 gods in the Tudor ruins. Fortunately, the 7 gods were fractured back then and the 4 countries attacked each other. After paying a certain price, we finally escaped the disaster. At this moment, Emlyn was in a rare state of being roused. He looked at Klein and said, "Honorable Mr. Fool, do you have the time to listen to my description of Blood Moon Queen's deeds and the glory the Sanguine used to have? That will be a heavy tome formed by pages of glorious expositions. I can repeat everything in them. It looks like you can continue on indefinitely. I used to think that you were a vampire who liked puppets and didn't know much history. I didn't expect you to be so professional and academic. No wonder you always believed the Sanguine to be noble and are proud of it. This kind of guy who doesn't like going out really will delve into deep research into a topic he's interested in. Furthermore, vampires have a sufficiently long lifespan. Klein hesitated, prepared to decline Emlyn's offer in a euphemistic manner. Although he had no lack of interest in the history, time didn't allow him to listen to them all. It's enough. Klein smiled and said, I like a fair and equal exchange, so I won't let you say anything without reaping rewards. In the future, when you have the chance, you can use your relevant history to trade for what you want from me. All right. Emlyn felt lost for a moment. This was the first time he had the opportunity to tell someone else about the glory of the Sanguine. Normally, in order to hide his identity, he wouldn't be able to show off to the humans. As for the members of the Sanguine, all of them knew what needed to be known, and he wasn't in charge of educating the newborns. Klein didn't say anything else and resumed his supercilious attitude. All right, you can go back now. A dark red light immediately lit up in front of Emlyn White's eyes, quickly devouring him. After a short period of dizziness, he found that he was still sitting in the rental carriage. Soon after, he saw an illusory goatskin parchment and gained the knowledge of how to request help from the Fool via a secret deed ritual. When I'm free in the afternoon, I'll immediately hold the ritual at home and ask Mr. Fool to dispel my psychological cue. Emlyn was suddenly excited. He waited until the carriage arrived at the Harvest Church before calming down and paying for the ride. After entering the cathedral, he was relieved to see that Bishop Utravsky was there preaching to the few believers of the church. He no longer felt as vexed as he usually felt and felt rather relaxed. In this state, he suddenly thought of something. Father Utravsky has never seemed to stop me from finding a way to dispel the psychological cues. What exactly is on his mind? Eastborough, in a greasy coffee shop. Klein, who arrived at the scheduled time, was enjoying wheat bread with fresh pea lamb stew while he listened to old Kohler's report of the information he had gathered over the past week. It was a pity that there was no valuable information inside. When old Kohler was done, Klein thought for a moment, then he pulled out £2 worth of bills and pushed them over. You already paid me just now. Old Kohler jumped in shock and waved his hands in front of him. Klein chuckled and said, within this week, I'll be heading south for a holiday. After a year of hard work, it's time to rest for a while. I might take 2 to 3 weeks before I return, so I'll pay you in advance. Heh, don't forget to help me gather information. Okay. Old Kohler accepted the notes with a mixture of joy and gratitude. At this moment, he had already thought of how to spend the new year. He planned to buy the cured ham he had been reluctant to buy and match it with his bread. I really can't stand the wait. Thank you, Detective Moriarty. He swallowed his saliva without realizing it. Klein picked up his hat, hesitated for a moment, and said, You should have noticed that Eastborough has been a bit chaotic recently. Don't take risks just to find out more information. If you notice anything wrong, immediately hide and avoid getting yourself involved. He was rather worried about the matter surrounding Prince Edessak, so he wanted to give old Kohler a reminder. I understand. Old Kohler patted his chest and said, I'm very timid. I won't take the risk. Very good, Klein praised. Then he remembered the laundry maid, Liv, and her 2 daughters, Freja and Daisy, who loved to read, and wanted to change their fates before he said whilst in thought, watch out for Liv's family. Don't let them be bullied. If there are any outbreaks in Eastborough, take them to a safe place. Outbreaks? You mean the workers' resistance? Old Kohler asked, puzzled. More or less, Klein answered vaguely. This was the limit of what he could reveal, otherwise, it would be very easy for him to be suspected by others or the sealed artifact itself. In a room with large and small dolls, Emlyn White came home at noon and sat in his chair, enjoying the gloom created by the curtains. He looked around and clenched his fists. I'll cheer for myself. With that, he rummaged for materials with spirituality and began to write the honorific name of the Fool, as well as the corresponding symbols and magic labels. After some hustling and bustling, he tried the secret deed ritual. His spirituality gradually dissipated, as if he had arrived at an immeasurably high place. Vaguely, he saw countless shadows of ineffable shapes, 7 colors of light that seemed to contain immense knowledge, and the grayish-white fog that stood above everything. Above the boundless gray fog, there was an ancient palace that was impossible to see clearly. Seated inside the palace was a person shrouded in gray fog. Then, Emlyn saw a figure of golden majesty and holiness, as well as black wings that blotted out the sky behind it. He didn't even have time to count the number of pairs of mysterious wings before he felt himself quickly floating upwards, making contact with that golden figure. Ah! He screamed miserably as he held his head and rolled on the ground, emitting green smoke from his body. It took a while for Emlyn to calm down, and then he heard the deep voice of the fool echo in his ears. Your psychological cue has been lifted. Is this what it feels like to dispel a psychological cue? It's really painful. Emlyn sat on the floor, panting, his neatly combed hair falling in disarray. Atop the gray fog, Klein thoughtfully nodded and said to himself, indeed, the sun brooch's purifying and dispelling effects can also harm vampires. He had calculated in advance that the sunlight needed to remove the weakened psychological cue wouldn't severely damage Emlyn, so he couldn't be bothered switching to a more complicated approach. And now, the result was indeed consistent with his expectations. After taking care of this matter, Klein took off the topaz pendant on his left wrist and planned to perform a divination. It is suitable to head to the Red Rose Manor this afternoon. After chanting 7 times in his mind, he opened his eyes and saw the spirit pendulum standing still and not spinning. The difficulty of divining something that involves a grade 0 sealed artifact or a corresponding powerhouse is too high. I'm unable to obtain any effective revelations. Klein sighed, knowing the gist of the matter. Then, he started to divine if it would be suitable to head to Red Rose Manor tomorrow afternoon, but he received the same signs of failure as an outcome. It's always said that divination isn't omnipotent, and it has now been proven. I have to decide on my own. I have to take this step, otherwise, there's no way for me to leave the stage unnoticed so as to go behind the scenes. The earlier the better, I can't delay it, otherwise, this matter might become completely impossible to recover from. As his thoughts churned, Klein came to a decision. He immediately returned to the real world, put on his double-breasted frock coat and half-top hat, and he walked out of 15 Minsk Street, heading for Prince Edesack's Red Rose Manor. Chapter 470, Name outside Red Rose Manor. Klein walked out of the carriage whilst carrying his cane. He closed his eyes and calmed himself as he looked at the red-uniformed soldiers standing guard at the door. Since sealed artifact 0-08 has been making coincidences to stop the woman with the sapphire ring from meeting me, there shouldn't be any exception today. There's no need for me to worry about running into her. As long as I fool Prince Edessak with my acting, everything would be fine. Klein thought quickly and walked towards the entrance of the manor. After being searched and handing in the gun holster and revolver, he followed a male servant's lead and walked across the gray slate road, past a fountain spewing clear spring water, and entered the main house. They arrived at the 2nd floor and arrived outside the room that was supposed to be a solarium according to the layout. During this entire process, Klein had his heart in his mouth, worrying that something unexpected would happen. He was afraid that the situation would develop in the worst possible manner. Knock. 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 After knocking gently on the door, a male servant approached the door and whispered, "Detective Moriarty has arrived." After a full 10 seconds of silence, a heavy voice came from inside the room. "His Highness has invited him in." The door creaked open and warmth spread outwards, with a temperature that was warmer than the hallway. Under the watchful gaze of the 2 tall guards, Klein stepped onto the thick, patterned yellow carpet. He took a few steps forward, skirting the cabinet that separated the inside from the outside, and he saw Prince Edessak sitting by the full-length windows, enjoying the rare winter sun of Backlund. The round, impressionable face didn't have the slightest trace of a smile, and this naturally created a solemn and repressed atmosphere. Because of the combination of the elegant fireplace and the metal pipes, the room was warmer than late spring. Prince Edessak wasn't wearing a coat, and his upper body was covered with a white shirt with cuffs which resembled blooming flowers and a pale yellow vest. Seeing this, Klein was actually secretly relieved, because the woman wearing the sapphire ring wasn't accompanying the prince. Thus, he quickly stepped forward and bowed. Edessak held a steaming cup of black tea in his hand and didn't invite Klein to take a seat. He maintained his previous expression and asked in a deep voice, "Any results from your investigation?" "No, my divinations, my spirit channeling, my interviews, my investigations all tell me that Talon died of a heart attack," Klein said with a heavy, painful expression with obvious signs of self-blame. "I'm just too weak in every aspect. Your Highness, you should hire a stronger and more powerful helper. Why don't you get someone better?" he added silently inwardly. It was only then that Edessak seemed to clearly notice Detective Sherlock Moriarty's face. He felt as if he had aged considerably, as though he had been unable to sleep at ease for a long time. It wasn't an illusion, because Klein had used his faceless powers before he left to adjust the state of his face, making his skin look dry and lusterless. He made his beard appear messy and his eye bags bigger, darker, and more obvious. Edessak was silent for a moment before he put down the white porcelain cup with a golden inlaid rim. "I understand. It's indeed like forcing a square peg in a round hole. I will have someone else follow up on the matter. Prepare an investigation report and don't leave anything out." "All right." Klein inwardly clenched his fist and quickly took out a folded piece of paper from his pocket. "Your Highness, there's no need for you to wait, as I always have the habit of recording things in writing." After instructing the attendants to take the report, Prince Edessak casually flipped through it and put it aside. "Is there anything else you need?" "No, Your Royal Highness, please allow me to take my leave." "Ah, right, I will be heading south for some time. I want to use the warm sunlight there to melt the pain in my heart." Klein sighed in response. "It's a New Year's custom of many in Lone." Prince Edessak nodded slightly and turned to Funkel, the old butler. "Send Detective Moriarty out and get him a carriage. The nearest town to Red Rose Manor is a 15 to 20 minutes walk. I'll have to hire a carriage when I get there." "Yes, Your Highness," the old butler bowed and said politely. Klein didn't let down his guard and quickly took his leave. He followed the old butler all the way to the entrance of the manor and took back his underarm gun holster and his weapon. Less than a minute later, he was seated in a Red Rose Manor carriage. He leaned against the carriage wall and watched the manor turn smaller as the distance grew. Klein relaxed and let out a long breath, letting his hanging heart calm back down to its original position. He knew that he had left the center of the stage. After that, it's time to bid farewell to Backlund and head south, a complete curtain call. After that, I'll change my looks and sneak back in secret. He calmly considered his subsequent plans. Suddenly, his spirituality stirred as his spirituality tensed up as he saw the door to the carriage quickly open and then silently close. Before he could respond, he saw a figure quickly outline itself. It was wearing a heavy black dress and had a sapphire ring on its hand. Sapphire ring. Upon seeing this scene, Klein, who was at the juncture of a flight or fight response, narrowed his eyes and sat back down, not daring to act rashly. This was a terrifying person who possessed a Grade 0 sealed artifact or was a demigod of a similar level. It's really true that the more afraid you are of something happening, the higher the chances are of it happening. 0-08 or something else, what happened to the coincidences you create? Klein's spirit and body instantly tensed up as he could only watch helplessly as the figure appeared in front of him. The lady's age was completely different from her dressing style. She looked about 18 or 19, had a round face, slender eyes, and a gentle and refined temperament. Deep down, she was sweet and was an outstandingly gorgeous beauty. Klein was surprised for a moment, before immediately recognizing her as he blurted out, "Trissy. Isn't this the fellow who had gone from being instigator Triss to witch Trissy? How did she go from being wanted to becoming Prince Edessack's woman? How did she, a member of the Demoness sect, end up by Prince Edessack's side?" And she even has a grade 0 sealed artifact or a mystical item of a similar level. When he looked again carefully, he saw that there was something different about Trissy. Her facial features, which weren't outstanding alone, were softer and more delicate, but when placed together, they were stunning. Hearing his surprise, Trissy became happy instead of being alarmed. She revealed a sweet smile and said, "You know me. I knew you know me." A detective with Beyonder powers definitely pays special attention to the wanted posters. She looks very happy. Klein cautiously asked with doubt and caution, "What do you want?" He clearly remembered that the person before him wasn't a good person. Triss had single-handedly created the tragedy of Alfalfa via instigation, while Trissy had caused the deaths of many innocent civilians in Tingen City. Trissy pursed her lips into a smile and said, "Very simple. Quickly report me to the Nighthawks, the mandated punishers, or the machinery hive mind. Get them to come here and capture me." "Calling the cops on yourself? This transvestite, this woman must be insane." Klein was a bit at a loss. He soon figured out the meaning behind her message. Trissy would rather be locked up behind Cheney's gate than stay at Red Rose Manor. She's trying her hardest to get out of here. Simply put, she believes that this place is more dangerous and more despair-inducing than being caught by the Nighthawks and mandated punishers. Klein tried his best to control his expression and asked in a deep voice, "What are you afraid of?" Trissy stood dazed for a second before she widened her eyes and said with her unfocused eyes, "There's someone manipulating my life. There are always coincidences that horrify me after they happen. And I'm becoming less and less like myself." Saying this, the corners of her mouth curled up as she said, "Can you imagine? Being someone who loves those shy and cute maids, can you imagine the pain when I wake up in the morning in the arms of a naked man? I can. That's why it's best to stay away from being an assassin or witch." Klein couldn't help but imagine such a scene, and his heart palpitated for a moment. Trissy continued with a self-deprecating smile, "I thought that by working hard to advance, to become pleasure, that I would be able to free myself from that weird state. Hence, I sought people to help me search for the corresponding Beyonder ingredients, but the outcome only turned worse. Sometimes, I forget a lot of things, but they end up really happening. I endured the disgust, seduced Talum, and tried to get him to help me escape. Who knew that I ended up killing him with a curse without me even realizing it? Do you believe that? They even changed my name. They wanted me to completely abandon my past self. No. Absolutely not. They thought I could only overcome the coincidences for a short period of time and that I would soon get back on track. It was just an impression I deliberately created for them, so I have managed to meet you, Mr. Detective. Pleasure. Demoness. Ingredients. Klein suddenly remembered that in the Beyonder gathering held by old Mr. Eye of Wisdom, Isengard Stanton, there had been a person who had requested to purchase the main ingredients of the Demoness of Pleasure potion. With him being aware of the formula, he instantly noticed it on the spot, but he had chosen to ignore it. He gradually forgot about the matter with time. So that was Trissy's helper. Was she already by Prince Edessak's side back then? Why do I somehow feel that her present smile looks so miserable but beautiful? A Demoness of Pleasure is sick. Klein took a breath, his thoughts in a jumble. As he was organizing his thoughts, he asked casually, "What did they change your name to?" Trissy furrowed her beautiful brows as she answered with a somewhat blank look in her eyes, "Trissy Cheek. Trissy Cheek. Cheek. Cheek." Klein suddenly raised his head, his whole body turning numb once again, as stiff as a marble statue. At this very moment, there was only one page of Roselle's diary that was madly reverberating in his mind. June 5th. I obtained an ancient book. It actually mentions the primordial demoness' name. Her name is Cheek. Chapter 471, Klein's Preparations. Cheek. The goosebumps on Klein's skin surfaced uncontrollably as he looked at the beautiful young lady with her misty eyes and furrowed eyebrows. The goosebumps were distinct and were accompanied with cold sweat. At this moment, he felt as if he had returned to Tinjin, back to the Blackthorn Security Company, and was about to activate his spirit vision to observe Megos and the baby in her womb. The fear that resulted from his instinct was so clear that it felt like a giant hand tightly gripping onto his heart. He finally understood that the thing interfering with the gray fog and his divinations wasn't a Grade 0 sealed artifact or a mystical item of the same level. There was something even more terrifying hidden within Trissy's body. The symbol of the apocalypse, the primordial demoness. No, she isn't the primordial demoness yet. Otherwise, I would have already lost control just by being together with her, turning into a pile of squirming rotten meat. She's in a very strange state. Trissy's brows eased as her eyes regained their focus. As she looked at Klein, who didn't dare to move at all, she gently lifted her right hand, allowing her slender white finger to slowly slide down from the side of her body. With a bit of grievance, seduction, and malice, she laughed and said, "If you can inform the Nighthawks, the mandated punishers, and the machinery hive mind about this matter, and I happen to meet you before they arrest me, I don't mind letting you know what true pleasure is." Klein's gaze subconsciously followed the movement of her fingers, and all sorts of mind-blowing details surfaced in his mind. They aren't considered big, but they are very firm. What am I thinking? What am I looking at? Is this the seductive powers of a demoness of pleasure? Ignoring the fact that you were once a man, even if you were a true lady, without having committed many heinous crimes in the past to lessen the psychological rejection I have, I wouldn't dare to. If you were to suddenly awaken as the primordial demoness, even the fool can't handle that. Klein silently sighed, raised his head, looked at the carriage's wooden roof, and said, "Do you think that I, an ordinary low or mid-sequence beyonder, would have the ability to escape the pursuit of the royal family? I think they've already discovered that something is wrong, and they're about to take action." Trissy felt somewhat smug that Klein didn't dare to look straight at her. She chuckled softly and said, "I'll try to escape and divert the main pursuing force. Although the remaining ones are still very powerful, it's not impossible to deal with them. I believe that you will fight with all your might for the sake of your own life. You have great hope." With that, her figure quickly disappeared, as if someone had wiped it away with a rag. This was different from Sharon, as it wasn't a return to a normal wraith state, but a direct form of invisibility. Bam! The carriage door opened and then closed. The sweet fragrance that remained drilled into his nose, and Klein retracted his gaze, his face sinking. Even now, his arms were still trembling slightly, as if he had contracted some disease. If it wasn't for his rich experience, even though he had faced the son of an evil god in the real world with a belly in between them, he, who knew what the name, Trissy Cheek, meant, wouldn't have been able to bear the terrifying pressure and would have collapsed on the spot. It was akin to having a rubber band stretched too tightly to the point of tearing. It seems like Trissy still doesn't know what's happening to her body. She also doesn't know the meaning behind the name, Cheek. Klein quickly calmed his thoughts, looked out the window, estimated the distance, and counted the time. His spiritual intuition and corresponding experience told him that doing anything in such a situation was better than nothing. Therefore, with the danger of being silenced at hand, he was prepared to try his best to save himself. 3, 2, 1. Klein suddenly opened his eyes and snapped his fingers. At the edge of the road, a small fire ignited on a tree with only withered branches left. The flames quickly soared into the sky. Several matches inside his pocket, that Klein had intentionally divided up, burst into flames, and a crimson color engulfed his black attire. His figure disappeared from the interior of the carriage, and he walked out from the flames by the roadside. Pa! 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 He kept snapping the fingers on his left hand repeatedly, his figure constantly flashing through the sparse, withered forest. He rode the flames and rapidly arrived deep in the forest which couldn't be seen from the outside. Then, he paused and pulled out the accessory hanging around his neck. He always knew very clearly that there were hidden elements behind this matter. Therefore, for his visit to Red Rose Manor, he abided by the rules of a magician. He had made some preparations beforehand, such as separating his matches and carrying a number of his mystical items on him. Among the mystical items, the biological poison bottle and the sun brooch were involved in the Capim and Wraith incidents. Therefore, out of caution, he left them above the grey fog. As for the all-black eye which was left behind by Nimblewright Master Rosago, it was difficult to get past the manor guards, hence, it was met with the same treatment. Finally, other than the 3 kinds of bullets, purifying bullets, demon-hunting bullets, and exorcism bullets of purification, he only brought along 2 mystical items. The first was the master key that allowed him to pass through obstacles. The side effects of getting lost could be offset by dowsing. Furthermore, it looked like an ordinary key, so it wasn't easily discovered. The other item was a key element of Klein's preparations, Edessak's copper whistle. Simply put, when he faced a danger he couldn't handle himself, he could ask for the help of a powerhouse. After that encounter, whether I recognize Trissy or not, I am definitely on a kill list. There's a high chance that I've been targeted by 0-08. There won't be any negative effects getting Mr. Edessak's help. Well, that's if 0-08 has been behind all the coincidences. Klein raised the cold ancient copper whistle and put it in his mouth, blowing on it. Without a sound, he activated his spirit vision and saw the white bones that gushed out from the ground like a fountain. He saw the nearly 4-meter-tall giant messenger taking form. It lowered its head and looked at him with his eye sockets burning with black flames. That huge body gave Klein a sense of security. He took out the pen and paper he carried with him and wrote a word, help. Next, he folded the paper and stuffed it into the messenger's hanging palm. After the messenger had disappeared, he put away the copper whistle, deliberately put on a prayer posture, and quickly chanted the honorific name of the Fool. Honorable Mr. Fool, my investigations have borne fruit. The woman Prince Edessak fell in love with is witch Trissy from the Demoness sect. She has already advanced to Demoness of Pleasure and the upper echelons have changed her name to Trissy Cheek. After quickly making the report, Klein didn't bother to hide his identity and immediately took 4 steps counterclockwise to head above the grey fog. Then, he retrieved the scenes of him praying, and he threw it into the crimson star symbolizing Miss Justice. He tried his best to feign a mocking tone and added in a supercilious manner that was congruent with the style of the Fool, Cheek, hee, that's the true name of the primordial demoness. After doing all this, Klein immediately returned to the real world, ready to run for his life. He had only taken a few steps when his eyes suddenly lit up. He subconsciously raised his head and saw several meteors burning with raging flames falling from the sky, tearing through the sky and enveloping the entire forest. At that moment, the scarlet light shone into Klein's eyes, giving him an indomitable feeling. He had never expected that the person he was up against would send meteorites from the sky to silence him. On a yellowing notebook, a seemingly ordinary quill wrote, for unknown, inexplicable reasons, the Dallas meteor shower arrived at the planet 2 days early. A portion of them just happened to land in the forest where Detective Sherlock Moriarty was hiding. Yes, just happened. Tuesday afternoon, in Audrey's study. The teenage girl, who was about to reach adulthood, was listening intently as Mrs. Escalante explained the connection between the intersection of spectator and telepathist powers with mysticism psychology. Beside her feet, Susie was sitting there attentively. Suddenly, she saw the endless grey fog and a blurry figure in a prayer position in what appeared to be a forest. Soon after, the words reached her ears. Prince Edessak. The Demoness sect. Witch Trissy. Demoness of Pleasure. Trissy Cheek. Audrey automatically filtered out the irrelevant details and noticed the most important words. So that's the reason. The person Edessak fell in love with is a demoness. Furthermore, many of the demonesses are transformed men. Why do I feel like laughing? Is this why he will bring danger to Backlund? Well, I have to warn father. But what method or excuse should I use? Audrey tried her hardest to control her expression and gaze, but her mind wandered. At this moment, she saw Mr. Fool leisurely sitting at the end of the long bronze table. She heard him say in a gentle tone with a hint of ridicule in his voice, Cheek, hee, that's the true name of the primordial demoness, the true name of the primordial demoness. The primordial demoness. As her mind buzzed, Audrey's expression instantly collapsed. What's wrong? As an observant telepathist, Escalante immediately noticed that something was wrong with Miss Audrey. Audrey thought for a moment and didn't hide her concern as she said, Ms. Escalante, I just remembered something bad. I should have told my parents before, but I forgot. It will lead to terrible and serious consequences. For example, the destruction of Backland, how few of the millions of people who live here, regardless of them being nobles, the middle class, or the poor, will survive. Audrey pursed her lips. Her concern couldn't be hidden in her sparkling, emerald-like eyes. Escalante frowned and said, will it be too late to do it now? It's better than not doing so. Ms. Escalante, please wait for me. No, you should leave first. Audrey entered her spectator state and calmly made her decision. Then she got up and left the study and went into the hallway. Father has gone to the House of Lords. Only Mother is at home. But what should I say? Audrey frowned slightly. She didn't slow down, nor did she increase her pace. Next to her were her personal maid and her huge dog, Susie. Gradually, she had an idea. When she arrived at the living room where her mother was, she had already made up her mind. Taking a light breath, Audrey felt an unusual sinking sensation on her shoulders. Then, without hesitation, she knocked on the door. Chapter 472, Latent Danger. Lady Caitlin was sitting on a sofa in the activity room, with the deputy butler, butler's assistant, and the attendant of the corresponding services seated opposite her. She was meticulous as she gave instructions on various things to take note of for the dinner banquet that night. This continued until her daughter, Audrey, came to her side. Mother, I have something to tell you. Audrey swept her gaze across the other people in the room. On the way to the activity room, she had felt a slight tremor, but she didn't discover anything unusual. Lady Caitlin looked around and nodded. All of you can return later. The activity room turned silent very quickly and even Susie was signaled by Audrey to leave. You should stay by my side more often and learn how to handle matters. Although you don't lack such content in your family lessons, it's still profound knowledge on how to effectively combine theory with practice. Lady Caitlin, who looked to be in her early 30s despite being in her 50s, smiled and educated her daughter. All right, my little angel, what is it? Audrey tried to produce the elegant smile she'd practiced in etiquette class, but she found herself with a heavy, nervous smile. She pursed her dry lips and directly said, Mother, I've been hiding something from you and Father. Oh. Lady Caitlin tilted her head, waiting for a further explanation. Audrey's words were a little staccato at first, but then they immediately became smooth and fluent. I'm already a Beyonder, the kind of person who possesses miraculous powers by consuming a potion. The blonde Lady Caitlin raised her eyebrows lightly and answered without any hint of surprise, I know. Both your father and I know about it. Huh? Audrey was momentarily at a loss as to how to continue. Lady Caitlin covered her mouth and laughed. You took so many mystical ingredients from the vault, and you are so naive to think that your father and I didn't notice? By your father's side, in this villa, and in the fief of our family, there's no lack of Beyonders. They may be a result of a simple employment relationship, or they may have been assigned by the Church of the Goddess, or they may have been members of the Hall family. His Majesty has tacitly agreed to such matters, and we have also tacitly consented to your little adventures. Sigh, you will eventually grow up and mature. Your father and I will never be able to protect you under our wings forever. You will have to face certain matters alone, so having additional powers to aid you as a trump card is good too. Yes, according to the general knowledge that I'm aware of, the initial stages shouldn't be that dangerous, and advancing will require 1 to 2 years, or maybe even 3 years. So, your father and I aren't too anxious, and we intended to wait until you become an adult to give you a word of warning so that you can stop at your present state. No, Mother, your general knowledge is wrong. You don't know the acting method. If I have all the ingredients, then I can become a Sequence 7 psychiatrist before the new year. Moreover, I do not wish to stop. The death of Duke Negan has made me understand that the world isn't as stable and peaceful as I thought it was. I want to have the power to protect all of you at critical moments. Mr. Fool is gradually recovering, and evil gods are making repeated attempts to descend. Although I'm still immature and lack the necessary knowledge, I can sense the hidden, indescribable dangers from these matters. Audrey had always known that she couldn't avoid the problem of taking Beyonder ingredients from the vault, but she thought that perhaps by chance, her parents weren't aware of the specific effects of those items. At most, they would suspect that she was getting deeper and deeper into her mysticism enthusiast circle. After releasing the burden in her heart, she paid no notice to her mother's exhortation and said, "Mother, I later joined a secret organization, one that's more academic and doesn't worship evil gods. Please forgive me for not being able to say its name and details, but I've already made an oath." Without waiting for her mother to ask, she cut to the chase. "I received word today that the commoner girl who Prince Edessak has fallen in love with is a demoness. I don't know what kind of plot they are plotting." The first two sentences of hers didn't contain any absolute connection. The former referred to the psychology alchemists, while the source of the latter was the tarot club, which was Mr. Fool. Through this arrangement of sentences, every word she said was true, one that could be confirmed through divination. However, it would make people believe that her news came from the secret organization known as the Psychology Alchemists. The smile on Caitlin's face gradually disappeared as she solemnly asked, "Demoness?" She didn't know much about the mysterious world, but the very word was enough to make her sense the evil and become uneasy. Audrey quickly nodded. "Yes, a demoness of pleasure. And what scares me even more is that her name is Trissy Cheek." "What's wrong with that?" her mother asked, puzzled. "A member of that organization has seen the name Cheek in an ancient book," Audrey said, the lie that she had already planned for. Whether it was her tone, her words, the details of her expression, or her body language, they were all flawless. In the fourth epoch or earlier, it's a name that belonged to the primordial demoness. Immediately after, she gravely added, "That's an evil goddess." Lady Caitlin didn't understand what the primordial demoness meant, but she knew exactly what an evil goddess meant. She couldn't sit still any longer and quickly replied with a question, "Are you sure?" "I'm not sure." Audrey didn't doubt Mr. Fool at all, but she couldn't say so openly. "No matter what, I think it's necessary to seek the royal family, get the Beyonders of the Church of the Goddess to confirm the matter. If it involves an evil goddess, it's always the right decision to be cautious." Caitlin looked up at her daughter in surprise. "Audrey, you've grown up." If it weren't for the urgency of the matter, Audrey would have pretended to be reserved upon hearing such praise. She would first modestly wheedle, then return to her room in glee. She might even twirl into a dance. But now, she couldn't care about that at all. She quickly let her worry and nervousness surface on her expression. "Mother, can you help me hide the truth? I heard that the Beyonders of the Church and the royal family abhor secret organizations that aren't a part of them." "Well, you can say that it was news which Father received. He should have plenty of channels for information." Caitlin stood up and gave her daughter a hug. "Don't worry, neither your father nor I will involve you in this. Your father won't be back until evening. I'll first let the hidden guards appear, pretend that he sent a message, then I'll get the Church of the Goddess to send Beyonders to protect our family." "All right," Audrey replied happily. At that moment, she finally breathed a sigh of relief. She was exhausted from maintaining her prolonged high level of tension. Looking at the few burning meteors crashing down at a high speed and enveloping the whole forest, Klein actually had the thought of waiting helplessly for his doom in despair. Even if he continuously used flaming jump, it would be impossible for him to escape the forest and the dangerous epicenter before the meteor shower landed. Moreover, the weak body of a Beyonder from the seer pathway didn't allow the possibility of him withstanding a head-on meteor strike. Even a zombie that wouldn't be wounded by a revolver would immediately be turned into minced meat under such an attack. Moreover, it would become charred black. Flaming jump. The yellow-white light shone into the depths of his eyes, quickly giving Klein, who had not given up, an idea. In a situation that was depicted in seconds, he didn't hesitate. He did whatever that came to his mind. Paw. After silently calculating the distance, Klein snapped his fingers and ignited all the remaining matches in the matchbox. A streak of crimson-red light soared into the sky, quickly enveloping his figure within it. Klein disappeared without a sound, appearing in the flames above the meteor. Whoosh! The meteor rapidly descended. The moment he leaped out of the flames, he was away from the meteor's vicinity, entering a region of air with frighteningly high temperatures. At the moment when he used his Beyonder powers to jump, Klein was immune to ordinary flames even if the temperature was rather high. However, upon exiting that state, he had to do his best to avoid the flames via flame controlling. Otherwise, he would suffer burn wounds and even burn to death. In addition, the hot air wasn't within his jump range. Paw. Klein snapped his fingers again, causing the air at a critical point to ignite. He phased into another flame, trying to avoid the first blast upon the meteorite's impact. However, no matter how many times he tried and how many risks he took, he still couldn't escape the danger. There were only two choices: to jump to a point away from the forest and suffer the meteorite's resulting blast, or to jump around like an acrobatic, waiting for the mushroom cloud to swallow him up. For a moment, Klein thought he could see himself being torn apart, scorched black with flames still burning over his body. A thought flashed through his mind, and his vision suddenly changed as all the colors saturated. The reds became redder, the yellows became yellower, and the whites became whiter, just like a strange oil painting. The oil painting seemed to be different from the real world, allowing Klein to watch as the meteorite slowly crashed to the ground. That patch of the forest was instantly destroyed, and the ground clearly quaked a few times. Plumes of smoke that were mixed with flames rose up, forming a strange mushroom cloud. Such an impact didn't affect Klein, because the blast simply didn't enter the superposed, still, oil painting world. Klein was stunned at first before he saw the human figure next to him. The figure had bronze skin with a medium build. He wore a long black suit and a half-top hat. He had a pair of aged brown eyes, soft facial features, and a tiny mole below his right ear. Mr. Edessak. Klein cried out in joy. He finally knew what scene the revelation from the divination he made a long time ago corresponded to. It corresponded to the present. The sea of blood represented a perilous situation, and being pulled up by Mr. Edessak meant being rescued because of him. Just as Klein's words left his mouth, Edessak waved his hand, grabbed his arm, and pushed his way through the deep layers of saturated colors. The ordinary-looking quill was no longer writing on its own, and its surface had dimmed a little. The solemn-looking middle-aged man with only one eye grabbed it and quickly wrote as if he was channeling a spirit. It was obvious that Edessak Eggers had yet to recover all his memories and strength. While attempting to travel through the spirit world and the astral world, a latent danger appeared as a result of this problem. Hence, he and Sherlock Moriarty found themselves landing near Zangwill and his friend. Chapter 473. Faceless. Everything around him was like an illusion. The colors were saturated and superposed as they quickly receded. As soon as Klein came to his senses, observed, and experienced this wonderful passage, he felt Mr. Edesack's hand which was holding his hand tremble slightly. Before he could even react, he felt a strong sense of weightlessness. His body couldn't help but plummet as he even began spinning. The colors of red, yellow, white, and black around him faded rapidly, and Klein fell, hitting the solid ground hard. The impact left his head spinning and his internal organs churning. Mixed into his vision were bits of golden stars as his vision was restored to normal. To his left was a bottomless dark valley that resembled the legendary Devil Abyss. On the right was a gray stone wall that continued to extend upwards, as if supporting the entire region. There was no sun, no clouds, and no fog. Some light came from the luminescent moss growing in different places, and darkness and heaviness were the primary tones of this world. Klein pushed himself up with his left hand and nimbly jumped up. He found that the ground beneath his feet consisted of properly paved stone which could accommodate 2 horse carriages traveling in parallel. It was definitely not naturally formed. One end of the road spiraled down into the dark crevices, while the other led to the top. From time to time, it was possible to see the domed hallways and halls inside the walls. Klein raised his head, but he couldn't see the highest point. His vision was completely blocked by the gray stone wall. Suddenly, he had an epiphany. He and Mr. Edessak had fallen underground, into the ruins of an ancient civilization. Is it another area, or are we still near Backland? As soon as Klein thought about it, he heard Mr. Edessak say in a low voice, "Leave here first. Head up." Before Klein could understand the meaning behind his words, he saw a flash of light from the side, instantly forming an illusory door that opened outwards. The door seemed to be made of bronze. It wasn't real enough, but it was unusually heavy. On the surface, there were countless strange patterns and indistinct symbols. With a creak, a crack appeared in the door. Pale, bloody arms reached out from the crack, one after another. In addition, there were also greenish-black vines with baby faces and sleek tentacles with protruded eyes. It's very similar to the effect of Miss Sharon's mystical item. While he was in thought, Klein noticed that the arms, vines, and tentacles were no longer as crazy as before. They had calmed down and stuck to the ground, completely unlike their former appearance of madly pulling a Sequence 6 zombie into the door. Immediately after, the gap between the doors widened, and a human figure emerged from it. The figure wore a pure black clergy robe, and his facial features were clear and distinct like an ancient, classical sculpture. His hair was dark gold in color, his eyes were dark blue, and he had a high nose bridge. He wore a bonnet which was popular with the elderly, and his sideburns were somewhat gray in contrast to his middle-aged appearance. Looking at the figure's completely lifeless eye, Klein suddenly recalled the name of the person who had just arrived. Inexplicable. The former archbishop who had directed the Tingen incident and dealt heavy damage to the Nighthawks team, as well as being the owner of sealed artifact 0-08. Almost at the same time, Klein turned around and, following Mr. Edeссak's instructions, fled towards the top of the road. He knew full well that being a Sequence 6, he would only serve to be a burden and distraction in a clash between demigods. In this race for time, false modesty and pretentious words were unnecessary. They would harm both him and his companion. Tap. 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 As there was nothing he could ignite underground, all Klein could do was grit his teeth and run as fast as he could. While running, he heard Edeссak's calm, gentle voice. "Run all the way out of here. Don't worry about me. I've recalled a lot of things, and I know that I once remained in a particular sequence for a very long period of time. That sequence's name is Undying." Tap. 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 Klein circled around the cliff and entered a dark domed corridor. The walls on both sides were engraved with mottled murals. At that moment, he heard a dignified and hoarse voice reverberate from where he previously was. "Teleportation is prohibited here." A figure had arrived beside Inexplicable without anyone noticing. He was floating in midair in defiance with the laws of physics. He wore a gorgeous gold mask. And Inexplicable didn't attack immediately. Instead, he glanced at the bend where Klein's figure had disappeared. Sequence 4 Nightwatcher of the Church of the Evernight Goddess's pathway could grant a certain amount of bad luck to others, but Inexplicable, who had just silently blessed Klein, realized that things like Klein slipping and falling into the ravine didn't happen. Not only that, Inexplicable seemed to be hallucinating as well, as he saw a thin, grayish-white fog. Without having the luxury of time to think, he withdrew his gaze and cast it back to Edessak Eggers. Tap. 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 Running at full speed, Klein suddenly stopped in his tracks. His spiritual intuition told him that there were people ahead of him, beyonders. They were most likely the guards here. After contemplating for a bit, he reached out with his left hand and wiped his face. At the same time, crisp sounds emitted from his body as his body grew 7 to 8 centimeters taller. By the time his left palm left his face, he had turned into a single-eyed middle-aged man with dark golden hair and a high nose, Inexplicable. Recalling the other party's demeanor, Klein used an illusion to change his clothes before quickly walking around the corner and entering a large hall. There were 4 guards in dark black armor, their gazes keen. Klein's face was calm as he walked over. He deliberately spoke in a hoarse voice and sternly said, "Someone has sneaked in here. I'm looking for him. Did you discover any clues?" The leader of the guards first examined him before lowering his head and saying, "Mr. Zangwill, nothing happened here." "Okay." Klein nodded slightly, walked past them, and left the hall. During this entire process, although he remained highly nervous with his back drenched in sweat, he appeared to be calm and reserved. He looked no different from Zangwill, be it his appearance or his aura. Relying on his faceless powers and his running speed, he quickly passed through 3 checkpoints and arrived at the end of the building. There was an illusionary door formed by pure ghostly blue light. Apart from that, it was completely sealed shut. Although he was worried about the demigod battle between Mr. Edessak and Zangwill, Klein remained hidden in the shadows outside the room. He patiently spied for a while and found that someone had passed through the ghostly blue light while another person had used it to leave. He noticed that those who left had to show something that looked like a badge before they could get permission from the 4 guards to enter the door of light. "I don't have time to wait for the next person with a badge. I can only take the risk. The battle over there could end at any moment. Even if doesn't, the search order will be sent over here quickly." Klein quickly made his decision, once again walking into the room with the likeness of Zangwill. Something has happened outside. He had no confidence in mimicking the former archbishop's voice, so he could only express himself with deliberate hoarseness as an indication that he had experienced an intense battle. The guards who were left confused by the news didn't react until Klein approached them. They reached out their hands to stop him. "Mr. Zangwill, where is your pass? Don't waste any more time." As he spoke, Klein pulled a badge from his pocket and thrust it into the man's hand. This calm performance made the rest of the guards relax. The moment the guard who had received the pass looked down, Klein suddenly lunged forward. Just as he landed on the ground, he quickly did another roll and went straight through the ghostly blue door. Only then did the guard realize that the badge in his palm had rapidly faded, turning into a piece of paper. On the top left of the piece of paper, there was a rather commonly seen blessing recently, "Happy New Year." The abyss-like crevice was filled with an illusory, pitch-black liquid. Moreover, the surface of the water was still bubbling without stopping, and many pale-skinned arms were wildly extending outwards. Zangwill had a general idea of Edeссak's standards, and he was neither surprised nor afraid, for he had a demigod to help him at the moment. What worried him the most was another problem. 0-08, which was forcefully developing the story, could backfire on him at any moment. At that moment, he swept his gaze past the corner of his eye and was shocked to find that the quill, 0-08, had left his pocket without him realizing it. It was floating in front of the gray rock wall, fervently writing lines of words. In a fierce battle, there would always be a variety of accidents, such as Zangwill's belt snapping and having his pants drop. The ghostly blue light filled Klein's eyes, constructing a passageway that overlapped with layers of light between the deep darkness and the roaming invisible creatures. Klein didn't bother to observe his surroundings as he scrambled to the end of the passage. He stood up, straightened his clothes, restored Zangwill's stern expression, and stepped into the rippling screen of light. After a moment of being mentally adrift, he found himself in another room, which was also occupied by quite a few guards. Something went wrong underground, keep an eye out. Do not allow anyone entry, Klein calmly instructed, walking towards the door at an unhurried pace. Yes, Mr. Zangwill, the guards replied respectfully. At this moment, the guard from before passed through the ghostly blue light and shouted loudly, "There's a problem with that Zangwill from before." Everyone turned to look at the door, but Klein was nowhere to be seen. Tap. 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 The guards immediately split up into several groups to search in every direction for their target and notify their companions. The scene momentarily turned rather chaotic. One of them had just rounded the corner when he saw Zangwill's back. Subconsciously, he pulled out his sword that coruscated with lightning and performed a forward cleave. Oof. The figure floated away weightlessly and became a splintered paper figurine. At the same time, 2 loud bangs could be heard. Pale golden bullets passed through the visor that wasn't pulled down and accurately hit the guard's head. Before he could even cry out, the guard collapsed to the ground with a thud, convulsing. Klein stepped out of the shadows in the corner and expressionlessly slipped the revolver back into his underarm holster. After burning the paper figurine, he quickly dragged the guard to an empty room and changed into black armor, switching his appearance to the fallen guard. Then, he picked up the lightning sword and left the room, closing the wooden door behind him and running forward in a panic. He was going to notify every guard along the way that there was a problem within Zangwil. Chapter 474, Edessak's story inside the solarium of Red Rose Manor. Edessak Augustus stood by the full-length window, looking at the indifferent Trissy with a gloomy face, and he said in a voice that was like a volcano about to erupt, "Why did you run away again?" Trissy looked past him and beyond the window, chuckled, and answered with a question, "Did you see the meteor shower? Did you feel the trembling of the earth?" Behind her, porcelain and other items in the cabinet had fallen onto the thick, soft carpet. The old butler, Funkel, was standing beside her. "It's not too rare for that to happen," Edessak replied in a low voice. Trissy raised her eyebrows slightly. "You are very dull. Then let me be frank with you. I am a demoness." Prince Edessak's expression didn't change at all. He turned to the old butler and said, "Guard the door and prevent anyone from entering." "Yes, Your Highness." Funkel gave Trissy a cold look and walked out of the solarium. When he heard the door close, Edessak exhaled slowly. "Trissy cheek, you prefer to be called Trissy. I know you're a demoness. The person who helped you purchase the Beyonder ingredients failed. What you received was provided by me. I don't mind that my princess consort is a witch or a demoness. I've even seen your wanted poster." Trissy was surprised at first, but she then revealed a mocking smile. "You sure know a lot. Did you know that I was once a man, and that my real name is Triss?" "What?" Edessak's eyes widened, and he tilted his head a little, as though he couldn't believe what he had heard. Upon seeing this, Trissy couldn't help but laugh. She laughed so hard that she frantically bent back and forth like a lunatic. You didn't make a mistake. I was once a man. I used to be like you, and the thing down there was longer and thicker than yours. However, the witch potion had forcefully changed my gender. Are you disgusted? Does it give you goosebumps?" She vented the words she had been repressing all this time before taking 2 steps forward. Edessak instinctively retreated, his Adam's apple moving involuntarily. "No, it's not like that. You're a real woman. There's no problem. I can definitely confirm that." He mumbled to himself, then he raised his voice and said, "From the moment I met you, you were a real woman. I don't want to know what you were like in the past. I can pretend that nothing like this happened. What I like, what I love is the present you." Stunned, Trissy raised her hand to wipe away her tears of laughter. "You're a really pathetic man. Do you still not understand? Our meeting wasn't a coincidence. Even your interest," she paused in disgust and continued, "even your interest in me was a result of someone else's arrangement. Don't you think that everything happened too quickly? I believe in love at first sight, but I don't believe that it possesses such powerful bewitchment properties. You act like the main character in a third-rate romance novel, becoming obsessed with love from just one meeting. You fell in love with a stranger, forgetting the type of person you once liked. That's crazy." Prince Edessak's eyes went blank as his eyes turned agape, but he didn't speak. His body suddenly swayed, as if he had finally awoken from a long dream. "Why, you are indeed my type. But my reaction, it's really too exaggerated." The corners of Trissy's mouth curled up, and she turned her head to the side to let out a sneer. "What a pathetic man, to have what you like being arranged by someone else. It's like you're a puppet on strings. Don't you understand? You're a person that can be sacrificed, and I as well as being a hostage for the cooperation between the royal family and the Demonist sect, am also a necessary disguise for this deception. I possess an important item of the Demonist sect, and under your strict supervision, I can be destroyed at any time and result in the loss of the treasure. This is the sincerity of our cooperation, and once the matter is exposed to the other 3 churches or the military, the development of this matter will be very simple. Prince Edessak secretly kept a Demonist due to his lust. After knowing of his heinous sins, he shoots himself in the mouth. Then, all the problems would be covered up. No. Edessak blurted out. Then, with a twisted expression, he asked, why are they cooperating with the Demonist sect? How could a hostage who might be abandoned at any moment know? Trissy gave a self-deprecating laugh. That's the whole reason behind why I want to flee. She lowered her head and chuckled in a low voice. Her body trembled slightly from the laughter. After a few seconds, she raised her head once again, curled the corners of her mouth, and said, what do you want to do with me? Strip me down and throw me onto the bed? No, you've probably formed a psychological resistance. Actually, I don't mind giving you some warmth right now. It's not a shameful thing for 2 poor people to comfort each other. Prince Edessak darkened his rotund face and looked at Trissy silently for nearly a minute. Suddenly, he closed his eyes, pointed to another side and said, you can leave. Leave through that door. Trissy raised her eyebrows in astonishment. You're letting me go? Yes. Edessak turned to look out the window and slowly replied, I'll stop Funkel. As for whether or not you can escape from the other pursuers, that will depend on your own strength and luck. A dazed look flashed in Trissy's eyes a few seconds before she quickly ran towards the hidden door. Before leaving, she couldn't help but look back. What about you? Edessak didn't turn his head, but he continued to stare out of the full-length windows as if searching for the shadows of his past. He smiled and said, me? Let me live in this beautiful story and welcome its final end, good or bad. Trissy took a breath and, without further ado, went through the secret door. In a quiet room inside St. Samuel Cathedral. One of the 13 archbishops of the Church of the Evernight Goddess, the person in charge of the Backlund Diocese, St. Anthony Stevenson, had received an urgent telegram from Earl Hall's residence. This bearded old man with deeply recessed eyes had an extremely clean appearance. Even though he wore a black and red archbishop's robe, he didn't give off a gloomy feeling. However, anyone who faced him would shudder from the bottom of their hearts. It was as if their spirituality was dominated by fear, or as if they were facing an unknown existence lurking deep in the darkness which stared back at them. Trissy Cheek. Primordial Demonis. St. Anthony lightly patted the paper and immediately stood up. The light around him suddenly vanished, as if swallowed up by the gloom of the room. All the worshippers in the cathedral instantly felt the coming of night. Everything quickly returned to normal as St. Anthony appeared in front of the Chinese gate beneath the cathedral. Today, the one leading the team was the spirit guide, Daily Simone. Without waiting for her to ask, Archbishop St. Anthony instructed in a deep voice, make preparations. The process shall begin. I'm awakening a sealed artifact. He wanted to use 0 to 17. He wanted to use that terrifying sealed artifact to confirm and deal with the Trissy matter. And this was the only grade 0 sealed artifact stored outside the Holy Cathedral. Only 2 of the church's upper echelons knew that it was in the Backlund Diocese. Yes, Your Grace. Daly was startled for a second, then she immediately responded. While waiting, St. Anthony closed his eyes as a portion of 017's information surfaced in his mind. Number, 17. Name, XXXXXX, Danger Grade, 0, Extremely Dangerous. It's of the highest importance and of the highest confidentiality. It is not to be inquired, disseminated, described, or spied. Security clearance, Pope, team of researchers, and Archbishop of the Backlund Diocese. Note, when the Archbishop is transferred out of the Backlund Diocese, the corresponding memories have to be wiped out using sealed artifact 1 to 29. Sealed method, the seal is completed through the combination of 1 to 29 and 1 to 80. Description, this isn't an item. This is a living angel. Her appearance is beautiful with black hair and eyes. Looks like a young woman, but her actual age cannot be estimated. She doesn't have the wings recorded in canon. Just from her appearance, she is no different from an ordinary person. She does not have the ability to think and has lost all sentience. Anyone and everything that comes close to her will completely disappear. Through divination and other methods, it can be confirmed that they're still alive but are impossible to locate. Currently, 1825 methods have been attempted, with every one of them failing. 017's range of influence will expand and contract without any pattern. Currently, it has caused more than 70 researchers to vanish. Warning, she cannot be used. Appendix 1, this sealed artifact first appeared in the Pale Era of the Fourth Epoch. Exact year, missing. Exact date, missing. Exaction location, missing. Appendix 2, based on the information, she has been awakened 5 times. By passing on the message to search for the Inexplicable imposter, Klein, with the help of divination, overcame the interference of the master key and ran all the way to the exit given to him from the revelation. He knew very well that with a carpet-style search, the corpse in the empty room would soon be discovered, so he had to race against time to get to the exit. A Faceless powers should be matched with a mystical item that can destroy corpses and clean up my tracks. Having gained true knowledge from practice, it didn't take Klein long to cross the checkpoints and patrolling teams before he arrived at the exit where the divination pointed him to. However, what made him even more surprised was that there were no guards here, only a heavy stone door standing there by itself. What's going on? Why is there no one guarding the exit? Was my divination misguided, or are the guards outside? As his thoughts raced, Klein found a corner and took off his armor, restoring his lightweight and agility. Then, he came to the stone door that opened outwards and groped his way to the corner of the left wall. After carefully checking with a gold coin, Klein took out the ancient bronze key. He leaned it against the wall and gently twisted it. Water ripples appeared as they spread out slightly. Klein silently passed through the wall, without taking the door. The first thing he saw was the natural light that fell from the dome, which meant that this place was really an exit. Klein carefully stood motionless as he quickly adapted to the light. He saw neat but mottled gray stones under his feet and thick pillars in front of him. In the middle of the hall, 4 hooded figures knelt around what appeared to be an altar. Soon after, Klein heard a soft but gentle female voice. "Mr. A, are you ready?" Chapter 475, Lady Despair. Mr. A? Mr. A of the Aurora Order? Klein, who had intended to cling towards the walls and shadows and proceed towards the door, shrank back silently. Inexplicable should be working with some faction of the royal family. Those who are able to excavate and hide such a large underground ruin near Backland must be one of the main powers in the Lone Kingdom. With Inexplicable and 0-08 participating in this matter, the Church of the Goddess can be ruled out. Although the people of the Lord of Storms are a bit reckless and male chauvinists, it's unlikely that they will work with the Demoness sect. At least until now, there have been no Beyonders who appear to be of the Sailor pathway. In the same way, the Church of Steam and Machinery aren't likely suspects. Even the Aurora Order is involved. What are they trying to do? Klein leaned his back against the wall and slowed his breathing, thinking and listening to the conversation in the middle of the hall. After a short period of silence, a hoarse voice sounded, "It's done." The answer was so concise that Klein couldn't make out what they were planning. The melodious and pleasant voice from before laughed in a low voice. "You don't seem to trust us very much?" "That's right," Mr. A answered bluntly. "Heh heh, then I'll be frank and describe our goal and why I'm seeking your cooperation." The gentle female voice didn't sound angry at all. "We've done certain things and left behind clear traces. Before we're discovered by the churches of Evernight, Storm, and Steam, as well as the military, we must do the corresponding cleanup, and this requires your help." "Yes, it seems like you don't really understand what I mean, so let me give you an example. Imagine you performed a heinous crime like murder in a house, So what's the best way of eliminating any evidence and clues? There's no need for that. It's our goal to have others witness such an act, Mr. A said indifferently. As expected of a member of the Aurora Order. They're all a bunch of lunatics. Klein made a preliminary identification of the speaking man to be Mr. A, who had killed the Intis ambassador. Suppose it were me, not you. The clear, soft female voice had a faint wheezing sound. After a second, Mr. A replied, burn that house and bury all the clues there. The clear and gentle female voice had a smiling tone. That's exactly what we planned. I'm in charge of committing arson, while you can use this opportunity to go with this development to create a passageway or vessel, so as to allow your Lord to descend upon this world. And the only price you guys have to pay is to bear all the infamy and gain the most enmity from the military and the 3 churches. But I don't think you would mind that. As long as we can welcome the return of the Lord, even if we're abhorred by every single force, we won't show any sign of cowardice. Mr. A's tone no longer appeared indifferent and distant. Arson? The Aurora Order will take this opportunity to complete the ritual for the arrival of the true Creator? This is probably the 3rd time. Why did I bump into this again? What a fucking bad twist of fate. Klein couldn't help but curse inwardly in Chinese. At this very moment, he was extremely curious and wary against the things that were plotted by this particular royal family faction, Inexplicable, and the Demoness sect. It was terrifying enough to even use the descent of the true Creator as a scapegoat. Perhaps they've kept some cards up their sleeves and will eventually destroy the Aurora Order's ritual in the end and destroy all the other factions except themselves. Klein calmly thought while feeling tense. It appears like you have no other questions, said the gentle female voice. This place is sufficiently well hidden and can be used for the required setup. You can do your ritual here at ease and won't need to worry that it'll be interrupted before you succeed. As for the things outside, we've already finished our preparations a long time ago. It's just waiting for the ignition of a spark. If you still have doubts, then you can make another round of checks. Just as Mr. A was about to speak, Klein heard a dull thud. It was the sound of the door opening. Who permitted you to enter? Didn't I declare that no one is to approach this area? The gentle female voice suppressed her rage. Lady Despair, there's an emergency. Someone has infiltrated the basement. The higher-up sent me to arrange for a follow-up and close the corresponding passages. A male voice with a distinct Backland accent responded very quickly. The so-called Lady Despair maintained her silence for a few seconds, as though she was communicating with an unknown existence to confirm the situation. Finally, she said without changing her tone, "Go back inside. Don't come out again, nor allow anyone out. Wait until further notice." "Yes, Lady Despair." The man ran towards the stone door, with a heavy thud sounding in the background. From the place where Klein was hiding, he could clearly see the stone door leading to the back area. He waited for 7 or 8 seconds before a figure of normal height and build appeared. Phew. The man took a deep breath, stretched out his hands, and bared his teeth as he pushed open the heavy stone door with a ferocious expression. In that instant, Klein had completely taken in the man's appearance and characteristics without missing a single detail. This was the beyonder power of a Faceless. That man's skin was reddish-brown, and he was clearly of southern continent descent. His facial features had no special characteristics, making it difficult to remember him. Due to him gritting and baring his teeth, he revealed a portion of his teeth. The 3rd tooth on the upper left of his mouth flickered with a golden light. It was a fake tooth. This. Klein, with the spiritual intuition of a seer, frowned as he felt an inexplicable sense of familiarity. Very quickly, he used his skills to recall the source of his familiarity. The hanged man had once requested the Tarot Club members to find a man with reddish-brown skin and a thick Backland accent who had the 3rd tooth on his left missing. The man's name was Balin, and he was involved in the escape and disappearance of many colonial island slaves. And at this moment, the man in front of Klein was almost identical to the Balin that was described by the hanged man. The disappearance of the colonial island slaves. The many tribes of the southern continent vanishing into thin air. Balin's appearance here. Capim, who took a large share of the underground slave trade, was protected by 4 Beyonders suspected to be of the Arbiter pathway. Among them, the strongest was a Sequence 6, and even a Sequence 5. Capim constantly targeted relatively innocent girls in his abductions. The passing of the Grain Act, the improvement of the textile machines all resulted in a large number of people losing their jobs. Many female textile workers silently left East Borough after receiving new jobs, not leaving any clues. The scattered dots instantly formed a line in Klein's mind, pointing directly into the depths of the earth. What are they up to, that they need such a large number of people, as well as so many pure and innocent girls? A ritual? An extremely terrifying ritual that takes a very long period of time while being held in secret? Klein's pupils suddenly contracted. Creak. Bang. The stone door closed and Balin disappeared from his sight. The hall was silent for a few seconds before Mr. A's deep and hoarse voice rang out again. I smell an accident. Let's begin. We need to hurry before it arrives. Lady Despair responded slowly, that's exactly what I was thinking. But I need you to send me to East Borough. East Borough? Klein had a bad premonition. No problem, Mr. A answered with a lack of emotion. Under the hood, a transparent and blurry book appeared in front of him. Accompanied by a distant and indistinct chant, he said, I came, I saw, I record. The book quickly flipped open and stopped at one of the pages. Soon after, it began to emit a light blue and illusory light. The light enveloped the white-robed Lady Despair, causing her figure to blur at first, then becoming indistinct. In an instant, Lady Despair saw countless indescribable silhouettes. She discovered lustrous brilliances which contained the bright and pure splendor of endless knowledge at the highest point. Her body was being dragged forward by a strange force as she rapidly tore through space. Not long after, she left her original spot and arrived at a secluded, uninhabited, and filthy corner of an alley. She pulled down her veil to cover her face and looked up into the sky. The afternoon sun had once again been obscured by clouds and fog, turning pale and dark. The light yellow fog wasn't particularly thick, and it sank down to every corner of Backland, giving off a slight choking sensation amidst its coldness and moisture. It's a pity that the haze didn't reach the point when it's in its worst and calmest state. The accident that happened to Trissy, the sudden and temporary loss of control over 0-08, the appearance of Edessak, the destruction previously caused by Dark Emperor, these had complicated matters, garnering the attention of others. It forced the operation to be brought forward to today. Lady Despair surveyed the area, walked out of the alley, and into the streets. Her steps were slow, as though she were wandering in a sea of fog. Wherever she passed, the fog would unnoticeably thicken. Tinged with an iron-black color, it silently lowered the range of one's visibility. As she left the street, a sallow-faced tramp in an old jacket suddenly coughed violently and fell to the ground. The 2 poor people close to the tramp retreated in horror, and then they covered their throats with their hands as they gasped for air. It was as if they were suffering from severe lung disease or bronchitis and could no longer breathe. A haze which was a mixture of iron-black and pale yellow colors descended upon East Borough, the dock area, and the smoke-spewing factory district as it continued to spread throughout Backland. Various scenes in the distance were drowned, and even the towering clock tower was only a pale shadow. One by one, workers and poor people felt the discomfort as they fought against the cold, and the disorderly tramps fell one after another in the woman's wake, their lives as fragile as the bubbles formed during laundry. Lady Despair's expression was calm and gentle, as though she were finishing a work of art. Like an ordinary person, she walked among the pedestrians as she chuckled and said in a low voice, "The Lone Kingdom's history will remember this day." The great haze of Backland. The dark valley had been completely covered by the black, incorporeal water, but 0-08 didn't stop writing. It fabricated ridiculous and terrifying stories wherever it could land its tip on. The dropping of pants didn't affect Zangwill's performance, because he was wearing a long robe, perhaps having anticipated a similar accident. The imperative mage stunned Edessak Eggers in the spot, robbing him of his two most powerful Beyonder powers at the last moment, truly a great assistant in every meaning of the word. However, the stacked door of the spirit world and the underworld were attracted by Edeссak's characteristic. It began being stirred by the powers of their battle, causing unpredictable changes. At that moment, an unknown existence was attracted, resulting in him passing by. He took this opportunity to extend his hands into the real world. Oh no! He caught in Zangwill. In midair, two bloody arms which were covered in squirming flesh suddenly appeared behind the clergyman robed in Zangwill. They caught in Zangwill's shoulders, dragging him into the void and into the spirit world. Chapter 476. The straw men light suddenly faded from where Zangwill disappeared, staining the area with the richest and deepest darkness. In the darkness, the sounds of melodic chanting could be heard. It was quiet and tranquil, hypnotic even. Even the countless pale arms flailing upwards underneath the pitch-black water seemed to slow down, no longer as frenzied as before, as if they had won redemption for their souls. In such a dark night, a figure walked out. It was none other than Zangwill, who had just been dragged into the spirit world. Compared to before, he had lost the bonnet on his head. The clothes on his left shoulder were tattered, and a piece of flesh had been torn off. Faint yellow pus bubbled out one after another. His eyes were no longer indifferent, but filled with pain, as if he was suffering some unimaginable torment. The 0-08 quill continued writing. Some might feel regret, while others might rejoice. Zangwill had the umbilical cord of the evil god which came from the baby in Migo's womb. It was from the true creator, and through the umbilical cord, he successfully escaped from the restraints of the unknown existence and forcefully returned to the real world, but as a result, he had lost that mystical item. In addition, he would suffer the ire of the evil god spawn from having failed to descend for a short period of time. This made his strength appear like some kind of commodity in a department store during a change of seasons, with only 55% left. Yes, this number is extremely accurate. In a street in the depths of East Borough, Old Kohler hurried back to his rented apartment, carrying some ham in a paper bag. He looked around warily, afraid that those ravenous wolves around him would pounce on him and steal his New Year's gift. He had seen wolves back when he was still in the countryside, but to his surprise, he was able to experience that familiar feeling in Backlund. It's still too expensive. I can only split the cost with someone else and cut it into pieces. This is enough for the New Year holiday. I can eat 2 slices of ham for every meal. 3 slices, no, at least 5 slices of ham. I can cut some of them off and stew them together with the potatoes. I don't even need to add salt. With this in mind, Old Kohler looked at the ham in his arms, seeing the white spots mixed in with the red meat, his throat couldn't help but twitch and he swallowed a mouthful of saliva. As he walked, he felt the fog around him grow thicker. The cathedral's clock tower that was still relatively clear in the distance was gradually swallowed by a mixture of iron black and pale yellow colors. Even the pedestrians around him were reduced to blurry shadows once they were 10 steps away. Old Kohler suddenly felt like he has been forgotten by the world as he raised his palm to cover his nose. Why does the fog smell so bad today? He muttered, and he quickened his pace. 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps. Old Kohler felt his face heat up and his forehead start to burn. His chest tightened, his throat felt uncomfortable, and soon he was experiencing difficulty breathing. Have I fallen ill? Damn it, I still want to have a good New Year's, and now I can only send my savings to the clinic or hospital. No, perhaps I'll be fine with some sleep. I'll be fine sleeping with a blanket over me. Old Kohler silently muttered to himself as his head grew hotter and hotter and his senses became more and more muddled. Gasp. 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 He heard his own labored breathing, and his hands went limp as the bag of ham fell heavily to the ground. Old Kohler instinctively bent down to pick it up, but he ended up falling to the ground. He held the bag of ham and tried to keep it in his arms. At this moment, he thought there was thick phlegm rushing up his throat, blocking it, so he fought back, making panting sounds. Thud. Old Kohler began to see, through his blurry vision, that a few steps away, someone else had also fallen and was gasping for breath. He was about the same age as him, in his 50s, with white sideburns. Suddenly, he understood that he was about to die. It reminded him of his own wife and children, who, like him, suddenly got infected with the plague and died shortly after. It reminded him of the time when he had been hospitalized. The patients in the same room were still chatting and laughing that night, but they would be sent to the morgue early the next morning. It reminded him of the friends he had known as a tramp, many of which had disappeared over the course of the winter until they were found stiff under a bridge or some spot which was sheltered from the wind. A small number died from suddenly having food. This reminded him of the days when he was still a decent worker, when the neighbors in the neighborhood would suddenly die like this. Some of them died from headaches, some of them died from accidentally falling into molten steel, some of them died from all sorts of painful, bloating ailments. Some of them even collapsed silently in the factories, one batch after another. This reminded him of what he had heard from a drunk in the bar when he was scrounging for information. People like us are like straw on the ground, falling when the wind blows. It's even possible to fall on our own even without the wind. The wind is coming. Old Kohler suddenly had such a thought. He clutched the bag of ham tightly as he groped the pocket of his old jacket for the crumpled cigarette he had always been unwilling to smoke. What he couldn't understand was why his healthy body would suddenly become ill. It wasn't like he had never experienced such a dense fog before. What he couldn't understand was the reason for him suddenly collapsing just as his life was back on track, moving in a direction that was sufficiently nice for him. Furthermore, he had been paid in advance by Detective Moriarty to buy his long-awaited ham for the new year, and he was looking forward to tasting it. Old Kohler fished out that crumpled cigarette, but he no longer had the strength to lift his arms again as they slammed heavily to the ground. He used the last of his strength to shout out the words that had been building up inside of him, but he could only let the frail words linger at his mouth without producing them. He heard his last words. He heard himself ask, "Why?" In an apartment at the edge of East Borough. Liv hung up the last piece of clothing she had washed and waited for it to dry. She looked at the sky outside, somewhat unsure of the time due to the thick fog which had appeared without her realizing it. "Anyway, it's still early, and we've already done the laundry." Liv's expression grew heavy. It wasn't a good thing to finish work too early. This meant that they could rest, but it also meant that they didn't have enough work, which would imply inadequate income. Liv took a deep breath, turned around, and looked at her eldest daughter, Freja, who was wiping her hands and casting her gaze towards the vocabulary notebook in the opposite room. "It's almost New Year's. Most of our clients have left Backlund and have gone on vacation elsewhere. We can't go on like this. We have to find new work." As she spoke, she walked towards the door. During this period, the rich will host banquets one after another. They definitely won't have enough servants and might hire temporary kitchen cleaners. I plan on inquiring. Freja, you stay at home and pick up Daisy when the time comes. We need income, but so do the thieves, bandits, and human traffickers of those prostitutes to welcome the new year. In the East Borough, every woman, who didn't work in the factories, had to be skilled or aggressive enough in order to survive. Freja answered briskly, "All right." Her mind was already on the desk and vocabulary notebook next door. Liv had just opened the door when she stumbled and fell to the floor. Cough. 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 She broke into a violent coughing fit as her face flushed red, with every joint in her body experiencing an unbearable ache. Freja ran over in panic and squatted beside her. "Mother, what's wrong with you? Mother, what's wrong with you?" "It's nothing." "Cough, I'm fine." Liv began to find it harder to breathe. "No, you're sick, sick. I'll take you to the hospital immediately." Freja tried to help her mother up. "It's too expensive, too expensive." "Cough, let's go to a charity hospital." "A charity hospital, I can wait. It's not a big problem." Liv gasped a response. Freyja burst into tears and her vision blurred rapidly. But at that moment, she felt her lungs burn, and her body went limp as she fell to the ground with Liv. "What's the matter with you, Freyja?" "Cough. You're sick too." Liv shouted anxiously. "There's money, cough, in the closet, cough, in the hole in the wall. You have to be quick. Go to the hospital. Get a good doctor." Freyja tried to say something, but not a sound came out from her mouth. Her eyes slanted up to the door beside her. It was their bedroom, their bunk beds. On top of it was her favorite table and her vocabulary notebook. Her body suddenly began to twitch. Liv's coughing stopped. Within the public elementary school at the edge of East Borough, the fog still wasn't thick yet, but many students had already started to cough. The experienced teacher on duty immediately ordered, "Quick, to the cathedral. We need to head for the cathedral next door." Daisy stood up in a panic and ran with the crowd to the cathedral next to the school. Suddenly, her heart palpitated as she felt the horror of losing something important. "Mother." "Freyja." Daisy turned her head sharply, wanting to rush home against the crowd. However, she was stopped. She was caught by her teachers and forcibly dragged towards the cathedral. Daisy struggled and screamed at the top of her lungs, "Mother! Freyja! Mother! Freyja!" In East Borough, the dock area, and the factory district, the old or those with latent ailments collapsed in the fog in succession like felled trees, while those who came into contact with them felt as if they had been infected by the plague. They died quickly, and even the able-bodied adults and children also felt slightly unwell. In their eyes, the light yellow and iron-black fog was like the descent of death. On the Tuesday of the last week in 1349, Backlund was shrouded in haze. In the corner of the hall, Klein pressed himself against the stone wall so that he wouldn't be discovered by Mr. A. Soon, he heard muffled groans and could smell the scent of flesh and blood. "Give up your lives for the Lord," Mr. A's voice suddenly sounded. Thud. Thud. The sound of figures collapsing entered Klein's ears, and a strong spirituality fluctuation appeared and constantly reverberated. Mr. A sacrificed his 4 attendants? Just as this thought appeared in Klein's mind, illusory layers of weeping sounds could be heard. Some of them were calling out for their mothers, others coughing violently, and some moaning in pain. As half of an expert at mysticism, Klein seemed to see a series of disgruntled and transparent figures entering the ritual one after another, followed by the years of numbness, despair, pain, and resentment from the dock area, factory district, and East Borough. Has it officially begun? Klein closed his eyes and leaned his back against the wall, his right hand clenching and relaxing. For him, the best thing to do at this moment was to slip out of the hall and flee into the distance while Mr. A was concentrating on the ritual. His right hand loosened and tightened before relaxing many times in a row. 7 or 8 seconds later, Klein opened his eyes, the corners of his mouth curling upwards in an exaggerated manner. He reached out his hand to grab the revolver, turned around abruptly, and dashed out. Dressed in his black double-breasted frock coat, he raised his right hand and aimed at the altar. Chapter 477. The many considerations of the fool. The first thing Klein saw was the altar, which was surrounded by layers of light, and the tall, thin figure standing in it. The figure took off its hood, revealing a beautiful, devilishly feminine face, with a left chest, shoulders, abdomen, and thighs all covered in squirming, sticky, disgusting flesh and blood. His surroundings were filled with illusory, transparent shadows that brimmed with feelings such as numbness, despair, pain, and depression. Beyond the altar, the 4 figures which were praying had fallen. Their skin was shriveled, and their bones were tightly wrapped, like corpses that had been eroded for many years. At the top of the hall, rays of light pierced through the air, quickly entering the altar through the stone pillars, floor, and air that were filled with symbols and magic labels. As soon as Klein emerged from his hiding place, Mr. A opened his eyes and looked in his direction. His pupils were dyed with blood, and an extreme madness was contained within his cold eyes. If it were any other beyonder, they would have subconsciously looked away, not daring to look him in the eye. But Klein, who had faced the eternal blazing sun and met blasphemer Amon, wasn't afraid of this. Calmly pulling the trigger, he sent a silver demon-hunting bullet engraved with many patterns flying towards the altar. Witnessing this scene, Mr. A subconsciously wanted to raise his hand, but he stopped in the end. He watched indifferently as the silver bullet drilled into the layer of light surrounding the altar. Silently, the patterned demon-hunting bullet melted and disappeared under the layers of radiance, engulfed in untold resentment and negative emotions. In the end, it completely disintegrated, leaving not a single trace of it behind. Klein's pupils shrank as he shot the rest of the revolver's bullets. The pale golden purifying bullets and the bronze exorcism bullets shot out, piercing through the radiant barrier one after another. However, they disintegrated in the same way and disappeared without creating the slightest ripple. Mr. A laughed hoarsely. "It's no use, puny worm. The ritual has already officially begun, and with your strength, it cannot be broken or interrupted. Even if you're a sequence 5 beyonder. But you're also fortunate. You will live to witness the coming of our Lord, and be integrated into his body." With that, Mr. A ignored Klein and closed his eyes again, as if he was indeed nothing but a puny worm. The shepherd raised his hands in a gesture of open arms and shouted out in ancient Hermes, "The Lord that created everything, the Lord who reigns behind the curtain of shadows, the degenerate nature of all living things. Your devout believers pray for your coming. I am willing to offer my body as a vessel to bear the burden of your great will." Amidst the prayers, a light from an unknown source appeared above Mr. A's head, completely enveloping him. The grievances and negative emotions that were gathered around Mr. A surged into his body like a tidal wave. Bang! 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 Klein snapped his fingers repeatedly and used flame controlling, trying his best to attack the altar, but they still couldn't resist being disintegrated against the barrier of light. "What can I do? All my other mystical items are above the gray fog. To take them out, I need to hold a ritual, which would waste at least a minute or two, and a body without protection would be very dangerous. What should I do?" Klein rationally stopped his attempts and stood there, his mind racing. Furthermore, whether it was the sun brooch, the biological poison bottle, the all-black eye, or the Dark Emperor card that raised his level, none of them seemed capable of breaking through the altar's barrier. Is waiting for Miss Justice's call for reinforcements the only thing I can do? Or do I just watch helplessly as the true creator descends? Klein tensed up, his thoughts rapidly flying through his mind. He quickly considered the corresponding strategies. As he considered each and every item on his body, his palms unconsciously broke out in cold sweat. Suddenly, he thought of something. Without having time to think about the consequences, he reached into his pocket and grabbed something that felt metallic. Tap. 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 Klein took a few steps forward, jerked his arm hard, and threw the object in his palm at the altar. With a flash of bronze, the object entered the barrier of light. It was an ancient, simple key. It was the master key. Within the barrier of light, the brass master key began to decompose and melt. And when its outer shell disappeared, the curse that was hidden within it appeared, connecting to the unknown area where Mr. Door was. In Empress Borough, the opulent villa of Earl Hall. Audrey stood by the full-length window and worriedly looked into the distance. She saw that the fog on the horizon was gradually thickening, turning a pale yellow that was dyed iron black as it slowly spread in her location. There's something wrong with that. The huge golden retriever, Susie, sat beside her and also looked at the commonly seen haze. Yes, I hope it can be stopped in time. Audrey didn't know what the fog represented. She silently prayed to the goddess and Mr. Fool that they wouldn't let the primordial demoness descend. Suddenly, she noticed that the branches outside the window were beginning to shake and the glass was slightly rattling. A wind is coming. Audrey felt inexplicably happy. Sherwood Borough, Holy Wind Cathedral. Terrifying storms that were visible to the naked eye suddenly appeared outside of it, and then they surged towards the east in an unimaginable hurricane. Whoosh! The thick, accumulated fog was blown away, and the rich yellow and iron-black colors quickly faded away. Whoosh! Dried branches fell to the ground as dust and dirt rose into the air, following the fog into the distance. Whoosh! Many of the pedestrians had their hats separate from their heads, and their bodies swayed so much that they had to hold on to trees or walls. The sailors in the dock area felt as though they had returned to the port city and were witnessing a typhoon. The smoke in Eastborough and the factory district thinned, and the healthy population felt relieved of their slight discomfort. Boom! Boom! Lightning leaped and thunder rumbled. They soon subsided, and a downpour began to cleanse the land. The Church of the Lord of Storms reacted rather quickly this time. It also has to do with us bringing the operation forward and not being fully prepared. Heh, those in the middle class and the tycoons would have shared the same fate in this great smog as the commoners if it wasn't for the respective protection they received. They would all be lambs waiting to be slaughtered. Lady Despair sat on a rental carriage as she leisurely heard the pattering of the rain on the glass windows. Even though her plans had been ruined in a timely manner, the haze from before had caused more than 20,000 deaths according to her calculations. Furthermore, there would be the subsequent spread of the plague. With this, I've pretty much digested most of my potion, but this is just a benefit I received as a matter of convenience. With large numbers of the population being wiped out, all this points to the Aurora Order and to the true Creator. No one could guess what the royal family really plans on doing. It's time I leave, along with the true Creator. Lady Despair thought while in a good mood. Her whereabouts were kept secretive, and she had taken care of everything beforehand, therefore, she didn't have to worry about being surrounded by Baklan's demigods at all. By the time they found traces of her, she would already be far away from the city. Just as the Lady Despair was about to leave the carriage, her vision blurred and she saw a figure appear before her. The figure sat across her. It was a young woman in a hooded classical robe, with black eyes and hair, and a beautiful but dull face. After throwing out the master key, Klein held Edessak's copper whistle, then he held his breath and waited for the results. If things failed to develop as he imagined, with the altar's barrier remaining intact, he planned on using Edessak's copper whistle to see if he could get any help from the messenger. If that still failed, he would go above the gray fog and use all the items like the Dark Emperor card. He had to attempt every possibility until the very last second. At this very moment, there was no crimson moon, let alone a clear full moon since it was afternoon. Therefore, Klein didn't have enough confidence in the curse contained within the master key, and he only hoped that the disintegration effects of the altar's barrier would threaten its very existence and cause it to react instinctively, such as communicating with Mr. Door in reverse and transmitting its cry for help to him. In just a second or two, Klein saw the master key disintegrate into the smallest particles of light and an illusory, distorted crimson. The crimson quickly faded as it struggled and then suddenly exploded. In an instant, Klein lost his sense of hearing. He saw the countless figures formed from resentment and indignation all raise their heads and scream. They rapidly transformed, tinged with a blackish green, and grew a second skull, a third eye, or even a fifth leg. They converged into a torrent and surged into Mr. A's body. Mr. A suddenly opened his eyes, shock and disbelief evident amidst his indifferent blood-red eyes. Soon after, the radiant layer of light surrounding the altar warped and collapsed. Boom! A huge explosion spread out from the center of the altar, setting off a terrifying storm. Crack! The four thick stone pillars closest to the blast instantly crumbled, and the distant Klein only had enough time to duck and roll before he was sent flying by the shockwave. Bam! He hit the wall, flattened into a thin sheet of paper. The subsequent wind quickly tore apart that thin piece of paper, scattering it in every direction. Klein himself appeared in the corner, using the walls to withstand the ensuing shockwave. The destruction caused by the master key exceeded his imagination. The curse that had been forcibly melted away really did have an instinctive reaction, as it transmitted Mr. Door's roar, and the voice of this forsaken entity, who was at least at the level of an angel, contaminated the resentment and numbed the despair needed for the ritual. As a result, the altar lost its balance and embarked on a path of self-destruction. The moment the blast calmed down a little, Klein rushed out to confirm the results. The illusionary figure and oppressive feeling in the air had already vanished, leaving behind scattered remnants of the altar. Mr. A had his body leaning forward as he knelt by a collapsed pillar. He was missing an arm, half a face, and a number of organs. His remaining eye was filled with bone-deep hatred. However, his wounds were quickly covered with squirming flesh. After that single glance, Klein didn't hesitate to run. For him, he had achieved the ultimate goal of foiling the true creator's descent. If he didn't leave now, was he, a Sequence 6, going to share a dinner with the shepherd, Mr. A, to welcome the new year? Chapter 478, Grade 0 Sealed Artifact in operation. The moment she saw the stranger appear in front of her, Lady Despair materialized a sharp, crystalline ice spear and threw it at her target. Using the force of the recoil, she attempted to break through the back of the carriage and into the street. With regards to this sudden turn of events, she was puzzled at this strange enemy who suddenly appeared. On the contrary, she was very confused and perplexed as to how someone could find her concealed self so quickly. It was no less difficult than destroying a large city, or teleporting directly from Baklan to the southern continent of East Balam. But as a Sequence 4 Demoness of Despair, she had developed herself one step at a time from when she was an assassin. She knew that she couldn't afford to be distracted or spout nonsense at such critical moments. It wasn't too late to think about all these matters later. Therefore, she chose to attack directly and wanted to take the opportunity to leave. She could already imagine how the strange woman with black hair and eyes would be frozen in the layers of sparkling light left in the frosty wake of the ice spear's trajectory. She would have to struggle to break through the obstruction in order to have the strength to chase after her. By then, she definitely would have escaped from the street and blended into the crowd. However, the scene she was looking forward to didn't appear. As soon as the crystalline ice spear left her hand, it silently disappeared into thin air. Its whereabouts were completely unknown. Angel. The Demoness of Despair's eyes narrowed as black flames suddenly surged from her body, spreading ailments in a bid to ignite everything around her and causing a large-scale fire. At that moment, her body trembled in a strange manner, and she froze on the spot. She saw her left hand disappear, 1 centimeter at a time, as it rapidly spread upward in an unstoppable fashion. In her eyes, the beautiful and lifeless eyes of the woman opposite her were dark and serene, as if there was a pure darkness concealed within. You aren't. You are. The Demoness of Despair's words came to an abrupt halt. Her entire body was like a sketch that had been quietly erased with an eraser, leaving no trace behind. Her final gaze was filled with fear and despair. The seat she previously occupied was empty, as though she had never sat in it before. The beautiful woman with the lifeless expression pulled the hood of her classical robe, and her lips moved almost imperceptibly as her figure instantly disappeared. On the outskirts of Empress Borough. On a trackless public carriage. Triss was sitting quietly in the corner, wearing a veiled hat. She didn't flee with the help of the river by going straight to the Tussock River, nor did she head for the nearest railroad to catch a train, as everyone thought she would. Her choice was to return to Bakland. Only in this city with a population of over 5 million, with all sorts of hidden factions and numerous beyonders, would they be able to help her escape the subsequent pursuit of the Demoness sect. At this moment, she felt tense, mentally, constantly wary of the terrifying old butler, Funkel. Suddenly, her head spun. When her vision returned to normal, she found herself having magically left the public carriage and was standing on the muddy road outside. Trissy's pupils contracted rapidly as she looked around cautiously. Then, she saw a black hooded figure in a classical robe, and she noticed the black eyes hidden in the shadows. For some reason, it was as if Trissy had returned to being an infant, so weak to the point that she couldn't put up any resistance at all. Cold sweat dripped from her forehead, and although her legs were trembling violently, she was unable to move. This is the scariest enemy I've ever faced. Even the high-ranking Demoness I previously met didn't give me such a feeling. Am I going to die here? Is this finally going to end after I persisted in escaping despite failing so many times? A deep sense of despair and uncontrollable sadness filled Trissy's heart, making her feel as if she had plunged into her deepest nightmare. Suddenly, a dim blue light flashed before her eyes, removing her curse of being unable to move. Trissy looked forward again, but there was no longer any traces of that extremely terrifying figure. Everything that happened just now seemed like the most realistic illusion. But when Trissy lowered her head, she was surprised to find that the sapphire ring on her left pinky had somehow shattered, losing all of its brilliance. Crack. 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 The remains of the ring and the gem fell off one after another. Klein dodged and rolled around the collapsed stone pillar and the heavily injured Mr. A, who was in the process of healing, and he ran for the entrance opposite him. As for the characteristic fragments which were slowly gathering from the remains of the master key, he didn't even take a glance at them, afraid that he would give Mr. A enough time to stop him. He was well aware that even if he had all his mystical items and was well prepared, he wouldn't necessarily be a match for the shepherd, not to mention the fact that he was only equipped with Edeссak's copper whistle and 3 types of Beyonder bullets. He didn't even have a single match left. Even though Mr. A was seriously injured, Klein didn't dare to take the risk. He had heard that the Rose Bishop, the sequence prior to Shepherd, was extremely proficient in flesh magic. Its healing ability was in no way weaker to his ability of transferring his wounds. Creak. He pulled open the heavy door. The natural light outside shone in, and the clouds in the sky were tinged with a thin yellow, and the sun was pale and dim. Klein rushed out and found that he was in the middle of a mountain. He was surrounded by towering mountains that made the area extremely hidden. Tap. 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 He frantically ran and wasn't even taking the mountain trail. Instead, with his skills as a clown, he ran down the steep slope, occasionally tumbling, and occasionally swinging up with the help of trees. Splash. He heard the crashing of the river. It was up ahead, just below him. But at that moment, a strong gust of wind blew over, sweeping towards his back. Klein made a prompt decision. His knees buckled and he rolled to the side. So. The location where he was originally standing and the direction he was moving in had a deep ravine carved out by the wind blades. Mr. A dropped out of the wind, his body still draped with a cape squirming with fresh blood. He pointed with his finger, and immediately, chunks of flesh flew out and swelled up in midair before suddenly exploding. Boom! Drops of blood and bits of flesh flew in every direction as Klein cartwheeled with his hands, dodging most of it before finding shelter behind a huge tree. The projectiles bored bloody holes through the huge tree. Traces of corrosion began spreading in every direction from the affected area. Back when Klein was running, he had already loaded his revolver. He was about to raise his hand and shoot Mr. A in the eyes when he saw a deep darkness appear within them. All of a sudden, Klein knew that, although the scenery around him hadn't changed at all, he had been forcefully dragged into a dream. He had once killed a nightmare at least. Klein maintained his consciousness and saw Mr. A phase to his side in a manner inconsistent with logic, turning into a blood-red blanket that enveloped him in a manner that couldn't be escaped from. You want to rely on nightmares to scare me to the point of stopping my heart? A thought flashed in Klein's mind and he responded. This was his dream. The lucid him could conjure anything. Thus, a pure and dazzling golden sun appeared. Clear and blazing flames ignited everything in its surroundings in an instant. Klein imagined the scene when he first saw the eternal blazing sun during the dream divination. Almost at the same time, he left the dream and heard a muffled grunt. Mr. A took a step back, 2 streams of blood running from the tip of his nose. The robe formed from flesh and blood began to slowly flow as though it was melting. Pa! Klein snapped his fingers and ignited the trees about 30 or 40 meters away. Beneath his feet, the long withered weeds caught on fire, and the soaring flames enveloped his body. Mr. A's originally unmanly beautiful face suddenly turned even more beautiful and feminine. A crystalline and weightless ice spear materialized in his hand as he threw it towards the burning trees a few dozen meters away. As soon as Klein jumped out of the flames, his pupils reflected the transparent tip of the spear. The tip of the spear became bigger and clearer, filling his eyes. Klein threw himself to the side as his body became covered with a thin layer of frost. The transparent spear then extinguished the flames, allowing the thick layer of ice to quickly spread in every direction. Klein, who was still in midair, suddenly curled up into a ball, turning his body upside down. He stretched out his left hand and lightly pressed on the layer of ice. He once again rose into the air and left the cold world. However, the skin on his palm was frozen at the point of contact. This resulted in him tearing off his skin with a ripping sound. Rolling to his feet, Klein reached into his pocket and pulled out a self-made slumber charm. As he was about to say the incantation, his nose suddenly started to itch and he sneezed. Achoo! 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 His head ached and he kept sneezing, leaving him with no strength to fight back. I fell sick. I became infected by some sort of ailment. The moment Klein realized this, he felt countless threads that were difficult to be seen by the naked eye twirl around him, wrapping him up like a mummy in a certain sense. He wasn't unfamiliar with this kind of experience. He knew that this was the beyonder powers of a demoness of pleasure. Back then, he had relied on the use of charms to cause all parties to fall into a deep slumber. Then, relying on his uniqueness, he escaped the effects of the charm. But now, Mr. A had maintained a distance of about 20 meters. However, Klein was no longer just a clown. The fingers he could still move snapped and made a crisp snapping sound. In an instant, all the spider silk around him was ignited, as if it had turned into a giant torch. Klein had just jumped out of the scarlet flames when he started sneezing again, which was then followed by a fit of violent coughing. This automatically prevented the use of many of his beyonder powers. At this moment, the feminine gentleness of Mr. A's face disappeared, adding a little more dignity to his loftiness. He stretched out his right hand and clenched it lightly. Klein suddenly had an inkling that if he ran, he would only be running in circles. Mr. A, who was wearing a blood-red robe, revealed a cruel smile. An ancient book that was transparent and illusory appeared in front of him. An ethereal, high-pitched voice rang out, I came, I saw, I record. Achoo! Cough! Cough! Klein wanted to hide, but he was powerless. At that moment, he experienced, in an unprecedented manner, the power of a shepherd. It was truly worthy of being called the most comprehensive, most flawless, and most powerful beyonder sequence under the level of a demigod. Even if he hadn't made any preparations, with many mystical items being unusable, for him to be suppressed to such a state without being able to fight back, it implied that there were many problems. Chapter 479, The Inexplicable Smile. The old butler, Funkel, was fleeing across a barren field in the wilderness. He had lost his hat, his neatly combed gray hair hung in an unkempt manner, and the outer layer of his clothes were muddy. Huff. Puff. He paused for a moment, panting as he looked behind him. He felt slightly more at ease when he realized that there was no one around. However, when he turned his head and was about to change direction, he discovered that a figure had appeared in front of him. The figure wore a hooded, classical robe. Its face was dull and expressionless while its black eyes were hidden in the shadows. Funkel's pupils constricted. He opened his mouth and tried to say a word in ancient Hermes, but he was surprised to find his nose disappearing and his voice gone. A look of despair suddenly appeared on his face. Then, like a stain in the void, his entire body was seemingly wiped clean with a cloth, and not a single trace was left behind. Achoo! Achoo! Cough! Cough! In the face of Mr. A's looming attack that spelled certain death, Klein was infected by an illness. His headache and fever made it difficult to use flame controlling or flaming jump. At that moment, he couldn't even produce air bullets. Fear of the unknown took over his mind. The clown's intuition for danger saw himself split into the smallest particles of light, perhaps taking away any chance of him reviving. In an instant, Klein reached into his pocket and took hold of an object. This was his answer to the most dangerous situation he could think of ahead of time. No matter what kind of situation he was suddenly placed in, a magician had to be prepared to a certain extent, so that he wouldn't panic in the middle of a battle. Klein took out Edeссak's copper whistle, brought it to his mouth, and blew hard over the sneezing and coughing. Without any stirring motions, he saw, through his spirit vision, a geyser of white bones spewing out as they rapidly sketched out the appearance of a huge messenger with black flames burning in its eye sockets. And at that moment, the pages in the book in front of Mr. A stopped flipping, and the distant voice suddenly came to a halt. A misty green brilliance surged out, and the bone messenger, that was almost 4 meters tall, cracked and crumbled into countless specks of pure light. Behind it, the force that had caused Klein to go in circles was the first to crumble. The figure in the black double-breasted frock coat was then enveloped, turning into a statue made of yellow sand which was blown away by the wind. However, the scattered sand were white spots, as if they were shreds of paper that had been torn to the limit. Klein's figure appeared on the other end, genuflecting and coughing uncontrollably. If it wasn't for the skeleton messenger blocking the blow for him, then he wouldn't have been able to suppress his ailments and use paper figurine substitute. And after that ordeal, his illness worsened to the point of him losing almost all forms of resistance. At that moment, Mr. A, who had failed in his fatal blow, suddenly coughed in a way more violent manner than Klein. He fell to the ground in pain, blood frothing at the corners of his mouth. Cough. 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 He coughed out a pile of fragmented organs and squirming flesh. Then, with great difficulty, he opened his mouth and attempted to lick them back into his mouth to forcefully consume them. What's going on? Klein was stunned for a moment. But that didn't stop him from resisting a cough, raising his right hand, and aiming the revolver at Mr. A's head. At this moment, he vaguely understood something. While Mr. A's injuries could be treated with his flesh and blood magic, the impact and backlash on his mind and spirituality couldn't be nullified through this method. Mr. A should have switched to another beyonder power to slowly heal the damage to his spirit body, but he was driven by hatred. He forcefully suppressed his injuries and chased after Klein. Thus, after continuously using the beyonder powers that exceeded what his body could bear, his situation worsened and the latent problems flared up. Bang! 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 Klein fired all the bullets in the revolver. Bronze, pale gold, and silver beams of light quickly crossed the short distance between the two of them. Unfortunately, he was unable to control his sneezing and coughing during the process. The bullets didn't all hit Mr. A, with only 2 of them hitting Mr. A, and one of them drilling through his forehead and the other into his torso. Sizzle. A sizzling sound rang out, but Mr. A's head seemed to be boneless. It was just a combination of a pile of rotten flesh. This caused the pale golden-colored bullet to sink deep into his body. It quickly came to a stop and failed to deal lethal damage. All it did was emit a golden radiance of sunshine. Mr. A lifted his neck, and the flesh around the hole in his head writhed wildly. He wasn't dead, not even seriously injured. He was once the tenacious Rose Bishop. Seeing this, Klein made up his mind. He turned around and ran, no longer making any attempts to attack. As for Mr. A, he was panting, and when he lowered his head again, he licked the bits of fragmented flesh and organs he had coughed up. Amidst the wheezing and coughing, Klein ran in random directions, occasionally rolling. Finally, he fled to the edge of a cliff which was over 50 meters away. Beneath the cliff, the slightly turbid Edessak River surged incessantly. It was wide but calm. Klein didn't hesitate and put strength into his legs and jumped. He plummeted, feeling the weightlessness of a free fall. His body tore through the air as he attempted to adjust his posture in midair, transforming into a standard diving motion. Cough. Achoo. His ailment stopped his 3.5 flips midway, and the positioning of his body and palms failed to be in the correct stance. With a splashing sound, he struck the water surface, reducing into a thin piece of white paper. The paper figurine quickly became moist, half sinking and half floating. At the bottom of the river not far away, Klein's figure formed as it shivered a little. His clothes were already soaked, as were the remaining paper and bills in his wallet. After distancing myself from Mr. A, the ailment has abated. Klein thought with a lingering sense of fear. If his coughing and sneezing hadn't subsided at the last minute, he wouldn't have even had the time to use paper figurine substitutes, and he would have suffered internal bleeding and instantly died. Of course, if he died in such a manner, he felt that he had a chance of being resurrected. While kicking his legs to keep himself afloat, Klein created an invisible, hollow tube in his mouth, allowing it to rise out of the water and bring him fresh air. This was the underwater breathing performance of a magician. Klein sucked in with his mouth and blew out through his nose, not letting the turbid gas he breathed out pollute the pipe by directly entering the water. At the same time, he stealthily made his way to the shore, hoping to avoid Mr. A's subsequent pursuit. Unfortunately, this isn't a city. The powers of a Faceless cannot be used effectively. Otherwise, once I break away, Mr. A definitely wouldn't be able to find me. While swimming, Klein instinctively had this thought. This resulted in him thinking of a problem, and that was the wind-controlling beyonder power Mr. A previously had. Generally speaking, this belongs to the pathway of the Lord of the Storms. For this pathway, apart from the wind, there's also water, which means they're especially effective for underwater activities. Underwater activities. Shepherd is so all-round and terrifying. Klein's heart almost stopped beating as the thought flashed through his mind. He suddenly swam upstream, no longer concealing himself. As soon as he emerged from the water and approached the shore, he saw Mr. A's devilishly beautiful face, covered with fish scales and gaping gills. Mr. A, who was floating on the water's surface in his bright red robe, had the corners of his mouth curled up. His eyes were filled with true hatred. Fight. I can only fight. I'll try to hold out until the church's reinforcements arrive or for Mr. Edessak to escape his predicament. Without hesitation, Klein, who had gained reprieve from his ailments, raised his right hand, ready to snap his fingers. At this moment, the two of them simultaneously looked at the sky as though it was an instinctive reaction. A beautiful feminine figure was quickly outlined. The figure was hooded and in a dark robe, its eyes looking blankly at Mr. A. Then, Klein saw Mr. A being quickly erased as though he had become a pencil drawing, wiped out rapidly with an eraser, leaving nothing but his look of indignation and despair amidst the blankness and madness etched into his mind that was the only audience present. This. What kind of level is this? What kind of strength is this? The moment Klein thought about it, he saw the figure turn to look at him. It was a beautiful face, but it didn't have the slightest expression. Its black eyes were deep and dark, devoid of spirituality. Just when Klein's heart was beating rapidly, thinking that he would disappear without a trace, without a clue as to whether he could be resurrected, the corners of the woman's mouth slowly lifted into a smile. A smile? Klein was stunned, wondering if he was dreaming. Before he could regain his senses, the figure instantly faded and disappeared from where he was. The sound of water splashing around him echoed in the air. Puzzled, Klein swam to the shore and got out of the water. Looking around, he found that this place was unusually remote. There were no roads or living people. Only the slightly turbid river water continued flowing in an unchanging manner. It ended just like that? Mr. A died just like that? Who was that lady just now? She was so strong that Mr. A didn't even have time to scream. And she smiled at me. Smiled. Maybe it's a she? However, other than figures at the level of the Pope, how could there be angels walking on the ground from the three churches? Furthermore, a figure on the level of Pope obviously wouldn't be in Backland. Klein couldn't believe that he was out of the danger zone. After a moment of contemplation, he finally felt a sense of reality. She should be a powerhouse sent by the churches. She arrived in time and successfully saved me. If I hadn't informed Miss Justice ahead of time, then they might not have taken such timely action. There would have been a high chance of me dying at Mr. A's hands, with the possibility of resurrection being a question. Yes, it also has to do with me persisting on, dragging on the battle all the way until this moment. Not bad at all. With a sigh of relief, Klein began to look for a way out. Exile. The man with the gold mask pointed at Edessak Eggers and threw his figure into the void, a spot no one knew. Then, He turned around to face Inexplicable, who was looking at him with a frown. There's no time, we can't finish him off that quickly. We have to hide this area as quickly as possible. Do you want the church to discover our secret? The man with the gold mask growled angrily. Inexplicable put away his doubts, nodded, turned to 0-08 which had stopped writing, and grabbed it. His figure was faltering somewhat, and by his legs were piled pants that had nearly been ripped apart in the middle of the battle. Inside Red Rose Manor, Prince Edessak sat by the full-length windows with an abnormally vacant look in his eyes. Your Highness, please hurry. A voice sounded beside him. Edessak's eyes turned spirited as he took a breath, picked up the revolver on the table, and pressed it against his temple. Inside it was a bullet that obliterated spirit bodies. He turned his head and looked longingly out at the golf course and the strolling horses. Bang! He pulled the trigger. Chapter 480, Honest Rewards. In the hall where the stone pillars had collapsed, a group of nighthawks wearing black windbreakers and silk hats appeared around the altar. The person leading the team was the Archbishop of the Church of the Evernight Goddess, St. Anthony Stevenson. It was disrupted by someone, he muttered without stopping and directly walked to the stone door that led to the interior. Rich darkness surfaced as the stone door silently opened. St. Anthony led some of the nighthawks in as they delved deeper. Along the way, they didn't discover a single guard or anything of value. It was as if this place had been forcefully swept clean. Finally, they reached a room in the deepest recesses, but there was nothing there but walls and stone pillars. The blue door of light which was there when Klein left was long gone. The lanterns in the nighthawks' hands suddenly lost their light, and darkness enveloped the room. When everything returned to normal, they found that the surrounding walls had somehow melted away. However, there were no hidden doors or tunnels behind them. It was either a thick layer of mud and rocks or the corridor they came from. St. Anthony was silent for more than 10 seconds before saying, "Try divination. Search the vicinity." Achoo! Walking through the pathless cliffs and forest, Klein was saddened to realize that he had apparently really fallen sick. The residual effects of Mr. A's beyonder powers, combined with the fact that he was drenched during winter, gave him the shameful cold. However, he didn't dare to stop to collect dry twigs to light a fire and dry his clothes and money. He was afraid that the beyonders of the church would find him. Even though he had already gained the endorsement of Stanton Isengard from the machinery hive mind and obtained the status of a semi-official, this was a matter involving the primordial demoness awakening and the true creator's descent, 2 cases of the highest order. Therefore, he was bound to be subjected to rigorous investigations, have tea sessions with the machinery hive mind, mandated punishers, and nighthawks to recount the whole process actively or passively. There were 2 major pitfalls to this. One was that he knew people inside the nighthawks, and although Detective Sherlock Moriarty looked quite different from the martyred Klein Moriarty, making it impossible to identify him via photographs, he had zero confidence if things were done face to face. 2. Because of similar pathways, the Church of the Evernight Goddess wasn't very friendly to people and things related to death. Back in the Pale Era at the end of the 4th epoch, death had fallen under the siege of the 7 gods, and Sherlock Moriarty had summoned a powerful descendant of death at the critical moment. This wasn't a problem that could be explained away easily. That high-level powerhouse was rushing to deal with Inexplicable in 0-08, so she didn't have time to bother with a friendly small fry like me. However, I can't be careless as a result. I should flee when it's necessary. Yes, I can write to the machinery hive mind when I have a chance, stating the second reason as to why I have to temporarily leave Backlund. This way, I might still have a chance to work with them in the future. Of course, I have to secretly observe to see if the machinery hive mind has any strong enmity towards any descendants of death. I wonder how Mr. Edessak is doing. Heh, perhaps Sherlock Moriarty might be dead in the official announcement. He sure lived up to his name and identity. As quickly as possible, Klein tried to find a small town and blend in with the crowd while enduring the alternating fever and cold. Only in human society could the faceless powers be fully expressed. The woman who was working with Mr. She should be a demoness. She went to East Borough. From the looks of the ritual, there must have been a large number of deaths over there. I wonder. With the spiritual intuition of a seer, Klein's heart suddenly felt heavy. At this moment, all the colors in front of his eyes turned saturated, as if they had been sprinkled with oil by a deity. The feeling was over instantly, and Klein found himself far away from where he had been, with the bronze-skinned, soft-featured Edessak Eggers appearing next to him. "Mr. Edessak, are you unhurt?" He couldn't help but heave a sigh of relief. "I am," Edessak replied frankly before smiling, "but to an undying, this isn't a big problem." Klein calmed down and asked, "What happened to Inexplicable and 0-08? Inexplicable is still alive, and he still wields that grade 0 sealed artifact," Edessak said as he walked. Klein tried hard to follow him as he couldn't help but sigh. "What a pity." "Don't worry about it, he was severely injured," Edessak solemnly said. "And most importantly, we know that he was secretly cooperating with the royal family, so we don't have to worry about not being able to find him in the future. This way, you can focus on improving yourself, and I can also try to go to a few places that I've recalled, to awaken more memories." "Heh, your luck isn't bad. I've been secretly observing the people from MI9 and the royal family to confirm Inexplicable's whereabouts. One of the most important places was Red Rose Manor, so I've always been wandering around the area. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to rush over to save you so quickly." Klein immediately felt a little awkward when this was mentioned. "Mr. Edessak, aren't you puzzled as to why I didn't die? I often wake up after entering a coffin as well." "This is something that I previously recalled," Edessak said with a smile, completely unfazed by the matter. "And in my incomplete memory, although it's rare in others, it's not without precedent. He often wakes up after entering a coffin." "Often?" Klein suddenly realized that the problems that he was worried about were nothing in the eyes of a real powerhouse. As expected of an undying of the death pathway. Well, Mr. Edessak had mentioned that he had been in this sequence for a long time, which means that he has long advanced. Klein thought for a moment, then he asked with concern, "Mr. Edessak, would Inexplicable discover that I'm Klein Moretti?" He was afraid that Inexplicable would take revenge on Benson and Melissa. "Unlikely. At most, he would believe that we knew each other long ago, or that you're my informant, if we use the terms that the police uses." Edessak recalled and said, "But that grade 0 sealed artifact might notice it, but you don't have to worry." "Why?" Klein pressed. It was unknown what Edessak had remembered, but his expression suddenly turned strange. It was as if he wanted to laugh, but at the same time, he felt horrified. That grade 0 sealed artifact will keep attempting to write down the death of its owner. This is likely to be intrinsic to it and cannot be changed. Therefore, I doubt it would actively divulge such important information that can put Inexplicable at a tremendous advantage during such a critical moment, unless it involves something that it cannot avoid or explain. Seeing that Mr. Edessak was so sure about it while producing such strong justifications, Klein exhaled. It was as if he had recovered a little from the cold. Seeing this, Edessak added, "It's best if you leave Backland for the time being. Inexplicable might use that grade 0 sealed artifact to seek revenge again, using your fake name. As long as you aren't in Backland, it should be fine. That grade 0 sealed artifact's sphere of influence doesn't exceed a large city. Just as I had predicted, there's a limit to its sphere of influence. Otherwise, Inexplicable could have easily hidden in a small town in the southern continent and leisurely arranged the fates of all his targets without having to worry about anyone finding him." Klein asked after some deliberation, "A short trip to Backland for a day or half a day is fine, right? With the premise that I've changed my identity and looks." With that, he rubbed his face, instantly reverting back to his appearance back in Tingen. Edessak's eyebrows twitched, and he nodded. "It's fine." He turned his head and looked into the distance at the spot that he could no longer see. "It seems like I've been targeted by a powerful existence of the Church of the Evernight Goddess. It's best if you don't stay by my side, or you might be implicated. They're very interested in the Beyonder characteristics related to death. Yes, I plan on heading out to sea. While I digest my potion, I'll be seeking mermaids. It's a condition for my advancement, Klein explained his plan. Edessak tilted his head. Mermaids? Could a mermaid in the form of a dead spirit work? I can find at least 4. Probably not. Klein reached out and wiped his forehead. His intuition told him that it was definitely impossible, but he planned to divine it above the gray fog to confirm it. Without mentioning the dead mermaid again, Edessak said, "If there's anything, then contact me through the messenger." Messenger. Klein suddenly felt guilt-ridden and ashamed. I had died in my battle with Mr. A. It saved my life. Edessak gave him a glance, shook his head, and laughed. Don't worry about it. As long as it isn't killed by a powerhouse at the level of an angel or via some special method, then as long as the underworld still exists, it can slowly be reborn there. And before that, I have similar messengers numbering. I don't know how many there are either. It sounds like there's an army of such powerful and humongous messengers. Klein turned agape, unable to say a word. His shame faded, and he asked curiously, Mr. Edessak, where is the underworld, or in other words, hell? The spirit world. To be precise, it's a special place that the ancient death created in the spirit world. Edessak didn't hide the truth. Ancient death? That should be the ancient god, Phoenix ancestor Greg race. So the underworld belongs to the spirit world. No wonder the basic structure in mysticism is the real world, the spirit world, and the astral world. It doesn't contain the underworld and the abyss. Klein was about to ask a question when he suddenly remembered something and quickly said, Mr. Edessak, I obtained a card of blasphemy created by Emperor Roselle. It contains the secrets of high-sequence Beyonders. I believe it can help you recall more things. However, you'll have to wait a while. It's hidden in Backlund. Klein didn't mention the bounty, fearing that it would reveal the Tarot Club's secret, the mysterious space above the gray fog, and Miss Justice. Therefore, he could show his gratitude towards Mr. Edessak for his help and sacrifice, in this tactful way. Aziz looked at him in surprise, but he ultimately said nothing. He nodded and said, when you get it back, have the messenger bring it to me. I'll immediately return it to you after I study it. Or you can copy the contents and pass it to me. He paused for a moment as if he had thought of something. Then, he took out a glove that was so thin that it looked like it was made of human skin from his pocket and handed it to Klein. I've already awakened the relevant memories, so I no longer need it. Heh, it's an item that pirate rear admiral left behind. I've placed some seals on it so that it wouldn't be hungry. However, every time it's used it will require you to use a human's flesh and soul to feed it, otherwise, it will devour you. Creeping hunger? The remains of a particular shepherd? Klein immediately recalled what the glove represented. Chapter 481, Statistics and People in a Small Town on the Outskirts of Backlund. After changing into clean and dry clothes, Klein placed the wet bills on the surface of the table, one by one, waiting for them to dry naturally in the warm room. During this process, he moved very carefully and very gently. Even his sneezing and coughing which were brought by the fever had been forcefully suppressed. To make sure there were no mistakes, he didn't dry them by controlling a flame. Having done all this, he walked to the corner of the hotel room, where there was a full-length mirror. Klein's black hair was neatly combed in the mirror. He had a pair of dark brown eyes, and his face was thin and angular. He had gold-rimmed glasses on the bridge of his nose and was beardless. He looked young but also experienced. This was a modification of Zhou Mingrui's appearance, with the traits of a native from the northern continent. Moreover, this was his youthful appearance during university when he was filled with vigor, one that had yet to be made fat by society. He intended to go back to Backlund when things have settled down a little, and then he would get himself a legal identity for his current appearance. Compared to when he left Tingen, he had no shortage of appropriate channels. For example, he had Ian at the Bravehearts bar, Miss Sharon's circle, and Detective Isengard Stanton. How nostalgic. Klein whispered. He busied himself with a ritual in the room where the curtains had been drawn. He planned to bring creeping hunger above the gray fog to study it safely. Inside the silent, ancient palace, he appeared at the very end of the long bronze table, leaning back in his chair while holding a pair of thin gloves made of human skin. Immediately after, he closed his eyes and extended his spirituality into the object that required sealing. He immediately felt the hunger of the glove. It was as if it had a stomach that could never be filled, but above the gray fog, it was so tame that it didn't dare let out even the slightest bit of malice. It was like a hunting dog lying there, not daring to move at all. Then, Klein heard cries of indignation and groans of pain. Many distorted, hideous, and grieving faces appeared in his spiritual perception, brimming with unspeakable melancholy and madness. These faces were deeply fused with the Beyonder characteristics of different colors and different states. Wherever Klein's spirituality spread, it would combine with the corresponding faces and use the powers it had. This is the way to use it. Together with the help of divination, Klein made one attempt after another and figured out what the 5 souls that the creeping hunger could let out to graze. The first was Faceless, but it only had the powers to change his appearance and build. The second was Psychiatrist. He could make a target fall into a frenzied state, place a certain amount of psychological cues, and could simulate a dragon's might, intimidating individuals and groups, and creating chaos. The third was Interrogator. It allowed the wearer of the glove to be proficient in the use of all kinds of weapons, become a demolition expert, possess the ability to focus his mind, and have the ability to pierce a target's spirit body. The fourth was Nightmare. There was only one power, which was to drag someone into a dream without being detected. However, it was unlike a Beyonder of the corresponding sequence. It was accomplished by creeping hunger, so the wearer could still move their bodies after entering a nightmare state. The fifth was Priest of Light. It allowed him to produce a halo-like effect, purifying all undead and foul creatures within a certain range. At the same time, he also had the singing ability of a bard which could strengthen his companions, as well as summon the light of holiness which was weaker than flaring Sunday. The limit is 5 souls, and the powers are fixed when letting them out to graze for the first time. This isn't something I can decide for myself. It's purely based on luck, maybe there can be 3 or just 1. Klein thoughtfully nodded, sighed, and said to the suffering souls, "No matter what kind of people you were in the past, I will gradually free you from your imprisonment to acquire complete deliverance. In the future, the souls I graze will only come from people who have committed heinous and unforgivable crimes. For every such Beyonder I kill, I'll replace one of you and release you, regardless of whether I need their powers or not." His solemn but gentle voice echoed within the ancient palace. The wailing souls quieted down, no longer writhing in a hideous fashion. Phew. Klein exhaled, opened his eyes, tapped the edge of the ancient table with his fingers, and said to himself, "That Faceless powers overlap with mine, so it's completely useless. Once I have something to replace it with, I'll release him first. Yes, when the time comes, I can attempt to channel his spirit and converse with him. Perhaps I might receive information regarding the high sequences of the seer pathway, as well as clues to the whereabouts of mermaids. No, there's no need to wait for a replacement. In a few days, I can make the attempt when I fully recover from my cold." The soul corresponding to the Priest of Light should be able to complete the incomplete formulas I previously obtained. Furthermore, he'll leave behind the corresponding Beyonder characteristic. That way, Little Sun doesn't need to worry about his subsequent advancements. Yes, he will be the second to be released. As for me needing to feed a human soul and flesh to creeping hunger every time it's used, that's not something I need to pay attention to. I usually wouldn't use it anyway. When using it, I'll definitely be facing a terrifying enemy. In such a battle, there's no lack of lives to cull. Even if there isn't, I can throw creeping hunger above the gray fog and not be worried about its backlash, nor do I need to be afraid of harming the innocent. The worst outcome would it becoming unusable. Putting his thoughts away, Klein tried to use the mystical item, creeping hunger, to divine the formula for the shepherd potion but ended up failing. He didn't divine the origins of creeping hunger, afraid that he would provoke an unfriendly existence. Although he wasn't afraid of endangering himself due to the gray fog's isolation and obstruction, doing so could likely damage creeping hunger. I'll consider trying that out when I no longer need it. Klein leaned forward and rested his elbows on the table. He quickly recalled the previous matters and keenly noticed a detail. After the master key was obliterated, its beyonder characteristic didn't disappear. Instead, it became dots of light, trying hard to converge. It can be assumed that the apprentice characteristic that's formed in the end will no longer contain Mr. Door's roars. In other words, such a method can be used to rid the mental corruption inside a beyonder characteristic. But the underlying problem is that there's no way to destroy a beyonder characteristic which has solidified into an item under normal circumstances. Back then, I was relying on a ritual that could allow a true god to descend. It needed the prerequisite of a large number of innocent lives. Also, once the all-black eye is shattered, the true creator's mental corruption that's hidden within will definitely erupt. When that happens, who can withstand it? Do it above the gray fog? As these thoughts crossed his mind, Klein remembered what could have happened at Eastborough. He hurriedly conjured a pen and paper to make the appropriate divination. After receiving the revelation, his expression sank, and slowly, he leaned back in his chair. Below him, the endless gray fog floated in silence in a seemingly eternal unchanging fashion. Audrey stood by the window, looking at the fog mixed with pale yellow and iron-black colors rapidly disperse. When she saw the heavy rain that was incompatible with winter, her heart felt more at ease. After an unknown period of time, she and Susie waited for Earl Hall's eventual return home. "Father, how is it?" Audrey asked with concern. Earl Hall smiled warmly as he handed his coat and hat to an attendant. "It's resolved, but the exact details are still unclear. My little princess, you've really helped me greatly this time. You deserve a ton of medals." That's good, that's good. Thanks to Mr. Fool's reminder, thanks to the risky investigation of his adorer. Our tarot club has once again stopped the descent of an evil god and saved the world. Audrey's heart was filled with pride. Earl Hall took the towel from the maidservant's hands, wiped his face, and sighed. However, this time, there were still some serious casualties. To think that Backlund's smog could become so deadly. Although the statistics haven't been tabulated, I estimate that more than 10,000 people died in Eastborough, the dock area, and the factory district. Furthermore, the plague is still spreading, so please try not to leave the house for the time being. More than 10,000 people? That was a statistic Audrey could understand but couldn't imagine. Only on the anniversary of the kingdom's founding and during the parade would she be able to see tens of thousands of people gathered together. However, this didn't stop her heart from feeling heavy as her mood suddenly turned gloomy. Daisy stood outside her apartment, watching the doctors and nurses in white coats and masks enter and carry out the bodies. She had long known the outcome. Her expression was numb and her eyes vacant. She subconsciously moved closer to the door. At this moment, the police officer in charge of the cordon stopped her. "Don't go over. Do you want to be infected with the plague?" Daisy stood there as she watched the two bodies being carried out. She saw her mother, Liv, hugging her sister, Freja, tightly. They were carried to a cargo carriage that was wrapped in black cloth and temporarily requisitioned. She then watched as they disappeared in front of her eyes as a white cloth covered them. The carriage slowly moved towards the other end of the street. At that moment, Daisy seemed to wake up from a dream. She turned around and ran at full speed, chasing after the carriage. The ground was abnormally muddy after the rain. She fell and got up several times, leaving her body covered in dirt. However, she was still unable to catch up with the carriage and could only watch it disappear around the corner. Daisy slowed her pace, her body swaying slightly as her expression turned abnormally vacant. She held on to the trees by the street and stared at the place where the carriage had left. Suddenly, her entire body went limp, and she started weeping. "Mother." "Freja," the voice was soft, low, sharp, weak, and lingered. At this moment, in Eastborough, the dock area, and the factory district, tens of thousands of people were similarly crying out in grief. Empress Borough, Sodila Palace. Wearing a crown above his resolute face and thin mustache, George III sat on the throne. He stared at the Earl Palatine in front of him without saying a word. "Your Majesty, the people from the three churches are waiting outside for your explanation," the Earl Palatine asked as sweat dripped down his forehead. Explanation? Prince Edessak was seduced by a demoness, causing him to collude with a cult and attempt to rebel. That is the explanation. His schemes were exposed, and he has already committed suicide. What other explanations do they need? George III suddenly flew into a rage. He took a deep breath and regained his usual solemnity. "You tell them that anyone who obtains the corresponding aristocratic title via any means can get a seat in the House of Lords. The property restrictions needed for elections will be relaxed, and the invalid constituencies will be removed. This is to appease the factory owners and bankers. Similarly, the National Atmospheric Pollution Council will immediately make their final statement. The relevant bill will soon be passed, and the minimum safeguards and working hours will appear in the form of a law. The poor law shall be reformed in accordance with their requests. The three churches are permitted to send their personnel into the military." "Your Majesty," the Earl Palatine was startled. Such a concession was beyond his imagination, especially the last one. George III flared up again. "Tell them this. Since they want a new order, I will give them a new order." "Yes, Your Majesty." The Earl Palatine didn't dare say anything further and left the palace. George III sat there, unmoving for a long time as though he was a stone statue. After an unknown period of time, his expression suddenly turned gentle. Chapter 482, Ring Out the Old, Ring in the new morning of the December 31st, at the Harvest Church south of the bridge. Emlyn White stood in a kitchen wearing his priest robes, occasionally tossing different herbs into a large iron pot and stirring them to a certain extent. After all the pre-prepared ingredients were tossed in, he waited patiently for another 10 minutes. Then, he scooped up the ink-black liquid with a metal ladle and poured it into a glass cup and glass bottle beside him. 48, 49, 50. Emlyn glanced at the empty pot and counted the medicine he had brewed. After confirming the quantity, he picked up a large tray and brought the bottles of dark green liquid to the hall. In the hall, more than half of the pews had been removed, and the floor was covered with tattered blankets. Lying within them were victims of the plague who were either in deep sleep or groaning in pain. Emlyn and Father Yutravsky worked together, each carrying some of the medicine, distributing it from two ends. The first person in the queue was a middle-aged man with a sallow complexion. He hurriedly propped himself up halfway, received the medicine, and drank it. He handed back the bottle and said to Emlyn in gratitude, "Father White, thank you very much. I feel much better and have some strength again." Emlyn lifted his chin and replied disdainfully, "This is only an extremely trivial matter that isn't worth being grateful for. All of you are truly ignorant." With that, he sped up the distribution of the potions. After 10 minutes or so, he returned to the altar of Earth Mother and complained to Father Yutravsky, "You should get 2 more volunteers." Father Yutravsky didn't respond. He looked at the patients and said with a gentle smile, "They should be completely healed in 2 or 3 days." "How do you know?" Emlyn turned his head in surprise. Father Yutravsky looked down at him benevolently and said, "Herbal medicine is one of the domains of the Earth Mother. As her believer, I do know some of the basics even if I'm not part of the Earth pathway." Emlyn sked. "I'm not interested in religion and know little about it." Although I've been copying Earth Mother's Bible in the recent months, he inwardly added in a slightly resentful tone before saying, "Father, I didn't expect you to accept non-believers in the faith. Among them, only 2 or 3 of them are believers of the Earth Mother." Father Yutravsky smiled without minding what he said. "They are also lives, innocent lives." Emlyn paused for a few seconds, exhaled, and said, "Father, I've already found a way to resolve the psychological cue. Perhaps I will leave this place soon." "Wait," why did I mention this? I was actually moved by him. What if he locks me up in the basement again? Emlyn suddenly turned nervous. Father Yatravsky's expression remained unchanged as he looked down and said to Emlyn, actually, you didn't need to seek out solutions. In a little while, the psychological cue will be automatically removed, and you will be free to choose whether to come to the cathedral any longer, and I would have become the Mother's, no, Earth Mother's devout believer. Emlyn blurted out. Father Yatravsky raised an eyebrow and said, feeling somewhat surprised, I didn't compel you to change your faith. The psychological cue I left in you was for you to return to the cathedral every day, hoping that you would be able to fully appreciate the value of life and the joy of a harvest. The only effect of the psychological cue was to make me return to the cathedral? Emlyn's expression instantly froze. Father Yatravsky nodded frankly. Yes. Emlyn's mouth gaped as he slowly and mechanically turned his head to look back at the altar, looking at the Earth Mother's sacred emblem of life, as if he had become a puppet that very instant. In the evening of the December 31st. 2 Daffodil Street, Tianjin City. Benson entered the house, took off his hat and coat, and chuckled. I've booked second-class tickets for the steam locomotive to Backlund on January 3rd. Melissa, who was sitting in the dining room with several newspapers in front of her, worriedly said, Benson, the air in Backlund is terrible. Tens of thousands of people have died from the poison and diseases caused by the smog a few days ago. It's a sad and regretful matter. Benson walked to the dining room, sighed, and said, but the 2 houses have already passed the report submitted by the National Atmospheric Pollution Council. There will be legislation to regulate the emission of smoke and wastewater, so a new Backlund will welcome us. You don't have to worry too much. Having said that, he smiled mockingly. When I came back from Iron Cross Street, I found a lot of factory owners or their employees from Backlund recruiting people. They said that due to the smog and plague, the factories there are suffering a shortage in manpower, so they're willing to promise that the working hours and minimum wage will be much better than the current standard. Heh. You think it's impossible? Melissa asked. When more and more people flock to Backlund, it will be impossible unless both houses pass the corresponding laws directly. Benson spread his hands and pointed to the table. Well, it's time to receive the new year. There were 3 sets of forks and knives, 3 empty porcelain plates and 3 cups on the table. 3 cups. 1 for beer, 2 for ginger beer. In the evening of December 31st. Dressed to the nines, Audrey stood inside a lounge, waiting for the start of the New Year's party. However, one couldn't see the excitement, exuberance, and joy on her face despite the fact that she was about to become an adult. In front of her was a newspaper. On it was written, according to preliminary estimates, a total of over 21,000 people died in the fog, and the subsequent plague took the lives of close to 40,000 people. Among the deceased were young children, healthy young men, and women, few. Audrey couldn't help but close her eyes. Just then, her father, Earl Hall, and her mother, Lady Caitlin, knocked on the door and said in unison, "Your beauty surpasses everyone tonight. Darling, it's time. The Queen is waiting for you." Audrey slowly breathed out and wore an elegant and beautiful smile. She then walked out of the lounge and entered the party's hall, under the company of her parents. She walked all the way up to the front of the dais and, under the gaze of many, handed her white, muslin-gloved hand to the Queen. The Queen led her to the edge of the dais as they faced all the guests. After a short pause, the Queen smiled and said, "Although this is a dark period in Backlund's history, we still have a gem that can illuminate the entire city. Her wisdom, her beauty, her character, her etiquette, are all impeccable. Today, I will formally introduce her to you. Lady Audrey Hall." Bang! 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 Outside the window, the fireworks exploded into a dreamy light. On the last night of 1349, Audrey officially came of age and was presented to society. In the afternoon of January 3, 1350. On the outskirts of Eastborough, in a newly opened cemetery. Using divination, Klein found the graves of Old Kohler and Liv. This wasn't a grave in the truest sense of the word, but rather a niche where an urn was stored. They went on, row after row, stacked one above another. Standing there, Klein saw that not only was there no photograph or epitaph on old Kohler's niche, but even his name was missing. Similar situations weren't uncommon. There were too many ownerless ashes whose relatives and friends couldn't be located. Their names, looks, and whatever experiences they had were unknown, nor did they garner the interest of anyone. They were only distinguished by the numbers on the niches. Klein closed his eyes, pulled out a slip of paper, shook it into a piece of metal, and carved a word on the niche's door, Kohler. Then, he added an epitaph: he was a good worker. He had a wife, a son, and a daughter. He worked hard to live. He withdrew his wrist, and with a shake of his wrist, the black-haired, brown-eyed, and emaciated Klein let the paper burn in his hands, as if it was a memorial service to all the souls residing in the area. Instead of appearing to help Daisy, who had lost her mother and sister, he anonymously wrote to reporter Mike Joseph, describing the girl's predicament in detail, so as not to implicate her in his own affairs. Mike had met Daisy, knew about her, and had enthusiastically promoted the establishment of a corresponding charity fund. Therefore, Klein believed that he could help her receive more help so that she could complete her basic studies and find a stable job that could support her. Taking 2 steps back, Klein looked around, taking in the names, photos, and even the victims who had those missing. He raised his head, let out a long breath, turned around, and left the cemetery. On the steam locomotive to Backlund, Melissa was engrossed in her textbooks, and Benson was soon chatting with the passengers around him. "It's too expensive, just too expensive. A whole 10 soli, half a pound." A burly man who wasn't even 30 sighed from the bottom of his heart. "If it weren't for the fact that I couldn't buy a third-class seat or a boat ticket recently, I wouldn't have spent this money at all. This is equivalent to half a week's worth of my salary." "Indeed, there are too many people heading to Backlund after the new year," Benson agreed. The burly man wiped off his heartbroken expression and said expectantly, "Because they promised me 21 soli a week and that I wouldn't need to work more than 12 hours a day, we signed a contract. When I receive my first payment and rent a house, my wife will come to Backlund, and she'll be able to get a good job, a job that pays about 12 or 13 soli a week. It's said that Backlund is in dire need of people. When the time comes, we'll earn a total of over £1.50 a week, and we'll be able to eat meat frequently. Your wish will definitely be achieved. The king has already signed the bill, passing the law for a minimum wage and maximum working hours." Benson sincerely wished him well before smiling. "This is the land of hope. Woo!" The steam locomotive brought countless hopeful people to Backlund. The sky was still bright, and the fog in the air had thinned a lot. The gas lamps on the platform were no longer lit that early. Experienced, Benson protected his cistern wallet before leaving the station with their suitcases while following the crowd. Suddenly, they simultaneously felt a gaze sweep past them. Tracing the gaze, Benson and Melissa saw a young gentleman with neat black hair and dark brown eyes. The gentleman with the gold-rimmed glasses pressed his hat and looked past them into the distance. Benson and Melissa also looked away and cast their gaze to the smoky pillars in the garden in the middle of the street as they looked forward to seeing the underground transportation system in Backlund. Carrying his suitcase with an expressionless look, Klein walked past them with his body kept straight. He entered the departure station, facing the mass of people pouring into the land of hope, people filled with wonderful hopes in their hearts. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. End of the 2nd volume, Faceless. Chapter 483, New Identity. The sky was dark outside the window, but it wasn't the dark fog which Klein was used to. The sea waves rolled in, blowing away all the smog and making the clouds line up in various shapes, reflecting the reddish-gold sunlight. This was Pritz Harbor, the largest and busiest port in the Lone Kingdom. Wearing a light vest and white shirt, Klein stood by the window and watched the outside world for a while until his pocket watch urged him to return to the mahogany table. In the warmth of the fireplace, he picked up a black, round fountain pen, unfolded a letter, and slowly wrote, "Dear Mr. Edessak, Forgive me for not writing to you until today, but for the past few days, I've been wandering in Backland, immersed in the devastation that has been inflicted on this great city by the events of the past few days. If we were ordinary people, perhaps we would have been covered with white cloth and carried to the crematorium, eventually settling in a tiny niche. I've waited for quite a while and finally found an opportunity to retrieve what belongs to me. This includes the card of blasphemy I promised you. In addition, there's another item which I will get the messenger to bring to you as well. It's a copper whistle that can summon a messenger. It comes from a chance encounter of mine, regarding an elder who crawled out of his coffin. I'm sure you're puzzled having read this, as the description I used similarly points to you. This is what puzzles me. This is exactly what happened. I suspect that the original owner of the copper whistle is a member of the numinous episcopate that tries to revive death. Furthermore, his level isn't low. Perhaps you'll be able to tell something from this copper whistle. Before leaving Backland, I will write to the machinery hive mind to describe the massive underground ruin where you fought in Sangwil. I hope that they will be able to figure out the truth with the help of this information. After going through a roundabout and indirect test, I've confirmed that they do not have any enmity towards you and me for the time being. If you're in trouble, perhaps you can try seeking their help. Finally, I have one more question. Is there any way to remove the residual mental corruption of a Beyonder characteristic that has already solidified? I am about to set sail. I wish you a smooth journey in finding your memories and a safe journey for myself as well. Your student and friend, Klein Moretti. Putting down the pen and reading it once more, Klein folded the letter and stuffed it into the envelope along with the Dark Emperor card and the copper whistle left behind by the suspected numinous episcopate member. When he was done, he picked up the copper whistle Mr. Edessak had given him and summoned the messenger by blowing into it. The messenger was still nearly 4 meters tall, made purely of white bones, its eye sockets burning with black fire. However, Klein's spiritual intuition told him that this was another messenger. Sighing secretly, Klein raised his arm and placed the letter into the messenger's lowered palm. The messenger lowered his head to take a look, before quickly disintegrating into bones and drilled into the ground like a torrential downpour. Seeing this, Klein lightly tapped his right molar and deactivated his spirit vision. He returned his gaze to the table, where there was a pale yellow identification card. This was a necessary item required for official purchases of any voyage tickets. For this, he had specially gone to Sharon and obtained a new identity through her circle. This identity was that of a bounty hunter, a lunatic who was eager to go on an adventure at sea to get rich. In accordance with Klein's wishes, his name was Gehrman Sparrow. A hunter of evil, Klein whispered, putting away a series of documents for his new identity. Shortly after, he drew the curtains, took 4 steps counterclockwise, and went above the fog. There was still some time before the tarot gathering, so Klein quickly retrieved Creeping Hunger and wore it on his hand. Closing his eyes, he tried to sense each and every twisted, illusory soul. He attempted to release the Faceless. In the real world, Creeping Hunger would happily consume this gift and spit out the corresponding Beyonder characteristic, but above the fog, it didn't dare to act rashly. It allowed the soul of the Faceless to leave the glove and appear to the side of the long bronze table. It was a middle-aged man with a blurry face. His twisted and painful feelings seemed to dissipate quite a bit. With difficulty, he bowed at Klein, who was leaning back in his chair. His figure gradually turned dim, almost plummeting beneath the gray fog at any moment. In the majestic palace, Klein could directly communicate, without any additional rituals prepared. Thus, he extended his spirituality and stabilized the man before saying in a low voice, "Do you know where there are live mermaids?" The man answered in an adrift manner, "Apart from those kept by the Church of the Evernight Goddess, they can only be found by sailing from the Gargas archipelago towards the Sonia Sea for at least a week. That was my destination." So he's also a Faceless seeking to advance. In order to seek out mermaids, he had taken the risk to go out to sea. However, he somehow died at the hands of Rear Admiral Hurricane Kalangos in the end. The Church of the Goddess rears quite a number of mermaids. Klein suddenly asked in realization, "Which organization did you belong to? Or should I say, where did your potion formula come from?" The blurry-faced middle-aged man's body suddenly trembled. It was only 2 seconds later that he spoke up. The Secret Order. I belong to the Secret Order. Secret Order? Doesn't the Secret Order rear their own mermaids? Klein hesitated for a moment before asking, have you ever seen your leader, Zeradol? The illusory and transparent Faceless was silent at first, but then he shouted with a sharp voice, I have. He's abnormal. He's an undying monster. As he spoke, his figure became increasingly thin, almost on the verge of dissipating. As expected, Zeradol is still alive. Just what had happened for a Secret Order member to be so afraid of him? More accurately, I should use him. Klein quickly asked about another key issue, apart from the treasures left behind by the Antigonus family and what your Secret Order has. Is there anywhere I can get the high-sequence Beyonder formulas for the seer pathway? The Faceless turned increasingly transparent and more illusory. He finally left the words, the Church of the Evernight Goddess. Cathedral of Serenity, the Holy Cathedral. Klein silently watched as the Faceless spirit body achieved complete liberation as he repeated the words. The Cathedral of Serenity was the headquarters of the Church of the Evernight Goddess, also known as the Holy Cathedral according to the Nighthawks. There really are high-sequence potion formulas of the seer pathway hidden there. I wonder how many secrets the various churches have kept buried and hidden. Sighing, Klein let the dark green glue-like substance, that had formed on the surface of his glove, slide onto the surface of the long bronze table. The Faceless Beyonder characteristic eventually formed a jelly-like translucent object. In the dark green background, from time to time, there were different faces emerging, like shadows hidden behind dark curtains. Klein took a few looks before nodding indiscernibly. He muttered to himself, I'll use the world later to get Mr. Hanged Man to sell this Beyonder characteristic either to artisans or Beyonders who need it. Although he had found a flaw in the official Beyonder surveillance of 15 Minsk Street by means of divination above the grey fog, he didn't return there so as to not provoke them or expose the secrets of his spirit body. Instead, he spent extra money to buy a change of clothing and other daily necessities. All of that amounted to £12. Together with the £8 paid for the documents of his new identity, his wallet was so empty that there was almost no need for it to exist. As for the 10% stake in the bike company, Klein found an opportunity to meet with Isengard Stanton and signed a legal agreement to entrust the matter to him. After all, their relationship wasn't a secret in the eyes of the Nighthawks or the machinery hive mind. I still have £5 in cash and 5 gold coins. It will cost £4 to head for the Rorstad Archipelago, and that's for a third-class ticket at the lower deck. It would take at least £4 to go from the Rorstad Archipelago to the Gargas Archipelago. I have to quickly sell off the Faceless Beyonder characteristic. This way, I would be able to afford a second-class cabin and eat decent food. Thanks to Emlyn's suitcase being placed above the grey fog all this time, I've had to buy another one. Klein silently went through his financial situation, feeling as if he had returned to the time when he had just transmigrated, relying on the salary of the Nighthawks before he could even buy a suit. A Sequence 6 Beyonder characteristic varies between £3,000 to £4,000. If I encounter someone in desperate need for it, then it can be sold at a premium. But apart from maintaining my living expenses, I have to consider the cost of the Nimblewright Master's supplementary ingredients. I also have to consider the cost of the ritual needed to eliminate the mental corruption. Klein sighed and took out his pocket watch to take a look at it. Seeing that it was about time, he sent a message to Little Sun to prepare for the gathering. Furza's vision turned clear as she saw 3 figures sitting across the long, mottled table. A new member? With a thought, she quickly settled down. At this moment, she didn't care if the Tarot Club had any new members. Her mind was filled with the incident of the smog and plague from last week. She vividly remembered that the world had warned herself and Miss Justice at the last gathering that something huge was brewing in Backlund, which could likely bring about a tragedy. Mr. Fool had confirmed that conjecture, and he had further pointed out that the person at the heart of the problem was Prince Edessak. She didn't doubt Mr. Fool's abilities and felt that the tragedy needed time to brew, giving her plenty of time to investigate. Who knew that it would come so quickly and so suddenly? Prince Edessak was also reported to have been infected in the haze and unfortunately died. It really happened. It really happened. Thinking back to the contents of the newspapers from a few days ago, she seemed to understand something, but she wasn't sure of it. For a moment, she felt terrified and uneasy. As a Sequence 9, I seem to have become involved with terrifying matters that involved a huge city, a prince, and tens of thousands of lives just because I'm a member of the Tarot Club. It was only at this moment that the magician, Furs, realized the importance of being a member of the Tarot Club. Then, she heard Miss Justice's usual greeting that lacked her exuberance. "Good afternoon, Mr. Fool. You saved Backlund again." What? When was I saved again? The Moon Emlyn listened blankly. You're tuning in to the Biyao's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.